Hey guys, today we have David Mullen. He's a cinematographer known for his work with the Polish brothers on Northfork and Twin Falls, Idaho. David has also photographed over 40 independent feature films, such as Jennifer's Body and Love Witch, plus several television series, including Westworld and The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel. David, thanks for being on the show today.
Yeah, hi. Thank you so much for being here.
Just start off, very surprised you even answered us. So thanks for coming. How long have you been following Shitty Rigs, or did you know about Shitty Rigs before this?
I've been several years on Instagram. Yeah, I just love the photos of the rigs. It just reminds me of my early days. So.
Yeah, because you started out doing a lot of indie features.
And before that, I spent almost 10 years on my own shooting short films in Super 8 before I even went to film school. I was 16 when I started making films, and I was 26 when I went to CalArts to study film. So,
wow,
I did a lot of my own shooting for a long time.
Do you remember why you were so interested in Super 8 so early on?
Well, that was the only film format you could get a hold of as a kid. You know, there was, in fact, the heyday was sort of over with by the time I started shooting, but everyone's parents had one in their closet somewhere. So, in high school, I did a short film originally for a Latin convention because I was studying Latin in high school. And it was a talent contest, and one of them was you could make a film. So I borrowed a friend's Super 8 camera, and we made a film, sort of a parody of the Trojan War. It's in the style of Monty Python, The Holy Grail, which was a big influence at the time. And then just caught the bug of filmmaking. I hadn't really thought about it until then, but the first day of shooting this short film, I had to establish the banquet of the gods where Paris, picks the Venus and gives her the golden apple and gets Helen of Troy. So I set all my friends in togas at this big banquet table, and I just started shooting 3 shots and 2 shots of people eating, run a few frames, pan over, run it in. And someone said, "What are you doing?" And I said, "Well, I'm shooting the banquet." And goes, "But isn't this just going to be very jumpy?" And I said, "No, it's just a couple of moments establishing people are enjoying themselves and eating, then we'll cut to a wider shot." And I hadn't studied filmmaking at all. It was just from watching television as a kid for so long, I just absorbed that language of movie making just from being an avid watcher. So.
You just understood editing like pretty early on, and sounded like.
Yeah, that's the way movies were, I thought.
Yeah, for sure. Did it also influence the way you made your own movies at that time? Like you could already visualize what the shots were going to be as you were shooting them?
Yeah, I was a graphic artist, so I would storyboard the whole short film and then shoot my storyboards. And so, yeah, I had a clear idea. Every short film I made, it was always, my goal was when I projected it with my Super 8 projector, does this feel like a movie, and what does that mean? What does a movie feel like? Well, use of close-ups, cuttings, montages, all these sort of things. So by the time I went to CalArts, our first class we had to take there was a beginner Super 8 class. And while everyone else went out and borrowed a Super 8 camera and brought in this out-of-focus footage of their friends in a park, handheld, I turned in this black and white film noir with Dutch camera angles and Russian-style montage editing and macro photography and dolly moves and film noir lighting. And everyone was like, "Shit, you can do all that with a Super 8 camera?" And I was like, "Yeah, that's what I've been doing for 10 years now." So I instantly first got typed as the slick Hollywood guy because CalArts was a very kind of hippy-dippy art school. But also instantly got asked to shoot everyone else's projects. So I hadn't planned to be a cinematographer, but within a month of CalArts, I was shooting a expensive 16 millimeter thesis film.
Oh, wow.
And I left first producer.
Yeah. Yes, I left CalArts with like 20 short films in 16 millimeter and one 35 millimeter film. So.
Oh my gosh. Just because you got a 10-year jump on all of them, basically.
Yeah. I mean, I always shot Super 8 with the idea that to make it look like 16 millimeter. And when I shot 16, I tried to make it look like 35 millimeter. I just figured if I could master these smaller formats, by the time I got the money for a bigger format, I'd already sort of know what to do.
Super 8 is such a unique format because, I mean, it seems so consumer, but you can do so much with it.
Yeah, I was struggling with the sort of consumer elements of it, but I had learned to manually set focus and exposure on it, and I had a wide angle lens attachment so I could get really wide angle shots, and it had a time lapse feature on my camera, so I played around a lot with those sort of things.
Did the school have a dolly, or did you rig up something your own?
Well, before I went to school, I built my own dolly. It was just a 2x3 sheet of plywood with cartwheels and a push handle, and then I bought some 12-foot planks to run it on, so I could do these 12-foot moves on this dolly. And then when I got to film school, we had some basic dollies there.
Yeah, nice.
Did your film school have a lot of like equipment and resources for you? Was it the kind of school where like they had just whatever was available at the time, or were you kind of
fairly, well equipped? For a '80s film school, it was Chris Malkiewicz was my professor, and he wrote the textbook Cinematography in the '70s that a lot of people grew up with, and so he instructed them on what to buy, and essentially the 16 equipment was all Eclair NPRs, which was the basic sound camera, and then augmented with Arri S's. And the Arri S's, because CalArts was founded by Walt Disney, the Arri S's were like model number 3 or 4. Disney had bought them for all those wildlife movies of Wonderful World of Walt Disney, like The Living Desert and all this sort of stuff. They'd bought a bunch of 16 S's, Arri S's. So CalArts inherited those, and so we had a collection of lenses for those 2 types of cameras. And at CalArts, I learned to use video for the first time. We had 3/4-inch U-matic video cameras in the studio, and so I learned basic video.
It's funny because me and Bert went to school probably in the early 2000s, and our school had all of that same equipment.
Film equipment, if it works, it doesn't really.
Tube cameras, 3/4-inch U-matic, and a bunch
my
of
thesis
RSs.
was on an SR2. Yeah. It's like the Super 16.
I mean, I love the Arri S is probably my favorite 16 millimeter camera.
That was the first 16 camera I ever used, because after shooting Super 8 for so many years, I got hired before CalArts to shoot some karaoke videos. Because someone had seen my Super 8 short films and wanted to do a karaoke video in Super 8. So I did one, and then they asked me to do a second one, and I said, can I shoot it in 16? Because the rest of the karaokes were all 16 back then. And they said, sure. So then I immediately ran out to a rental house, I think it was Burns and Sawyer, and I said, can you show me how to thread a 16 camera? So they brought an Arri S and gave me a dummy load and showed me how to thread it, and I shot the short film on +X black and white reversal, which is what I'd been shooting my Super 8 films in, but now it was 16. It looked really good. And I remember shooting that karaoke video. It was a storyline was about a guy in a trench in World War I. So we built a trench in the backyard of a house and had a guy in a World War I uniform. But he looks up in the sky, and I'd taken a slide of the full moon I'd bought from I think the Air and Space Museum or something when I was a kid, and had it blown up to a 8x10 transparency, and then cut it out and put it into a black cardboard foam core thing, and then poked holes in for stars, and then rephotographed it. So I had the full moon with stars in the sky that he could look up into. And the producer was like, how the hell did you do that? It's very
printing already.
Very convincing. Yeah.
That's the magic of it, right?
Yeah. Well, in high school, once I got into filmmaking for a little while, I thought I would go into visual effects. I was heavily influenced by science fiction as a kid. So I read all these books on visual effects work, and I studied it in my early years of college, but not lost interest, but I realized at some point that I wasn't meant for effects work. It was, even though I could paint and build models and understood optical printing and all these sort of elements, I realized that time-consuming aspect of visual effects wasn't meant for me. It was a key moment. I was watching Empire Strikes Back, and there was my favorite effect shot in there is a low-angle shot of the Imperial walkers against the dawn sky during the ice battle. And it's so moody and convincing, this low looming angle of them over the lens. And I said, how do they make that so realistic? And the DP of the effects unit said in the Cinefex article, I just shot them against the sky backing with a fog filter on the camera and then underexposed them so they looked silhouette-y. And I realized it was all photography. It wasn't the only visual effects aspect of it was that it was a sky backing with models and it was stop motion, but the mood of the shot was all lighting and exposure and filtering. And I sort of realized that's what I was more interested in than spending months and months on one shot doing the visual effects. So, but studying visual effects for a number of years has been helpful as a DP now, because I can talk to a visual effects supervisor and understand why someone has to be behind someone or in front of someone, and when you need a key and when you don't need a key, and whether it should be a luminance key or a chroma key, and all these sort of things that I understand.
Yeah, and visual effects is in everything now.
Yeah.
I feel like even things that you're like, oh, why would there be visual effects in this? There's visual effects in it.
Yeah.
So,
but it helps for any visual effects person to have a photographic background, because you're trying to recreate real life photography. So when I'm talking to the visual effects supervisor, I'll often say, well, if this were a real shot, I'd be shooting at 2.8 and that background would be this soft and you'd have to pull focus. Or if we tracked from outside and through a window inside, I would be doing a stop pull. There's no way I could light the interior to the same level as the exterior. So I would have you would see exposure change as I went through a window or things like that. So we have to recreate those sort of artifacts of photography to make the effect more convincing, So it's good to understand photography when creating visual effects.
So then you get out of CalArts. You have, 20 films? Is that what you said?
Yeah,
under your belt already?
Films, yeah.
Do you immediately go into like shooting indies because you have this massive resume of short films, or?
I never worked as a assistant or anything. I came out of CalArts. Within a year, I did a feature film with a CalArts graduate that was, not paying, very low budget indie film, but it was in 35 millimeter, donated equipment, lab work, stock, all this sort of thing. And then a year after that, I got another 35 feature, which was a straight to video thriller. And that started me on a path of doing like 7 of those kind of films. They all ended up on Lifetime. They still show up now and then, but
Nice.
They're all family in danger movies and stuff. So I did that for a while, but I wasn't really making a living at them. They're all non-union. And even if maybe they'd pay $1,000 a week and they were like a 3-week feature and with a week prep. So that's $4,000. If I did 3 of them a year, I'd make $12,000. So, I'd make more money working at Starbucks than shooting features. So, but I did this for a while, almost another decade of independent films. But at some point I had about 13 of these kind of B movies on my resume. And I knew other DPs who had similar resumes who were much older than me. And I thought, I don't want to be, 50 years old with a bunch of non-union, B movies that, women in prison kind of films. I just don't want to have that kind of career. I want to do studio films and things. So I stopped taking those jobs, and I got a call from Michael Polish from CalArts, who I hadn't met at CalArts. He was an art student when I was a film student, but he started making films after he graduated. And so he asked around like who was shooting for CalArts graduates, and then got my name, and I did a short film for him. And then 2 years later, he got funding for his first feature, which was Twin Falls, Idaho. So that was in 1998. And it was like my 13th feature. It was a 16-day film for $500,000. And but it got picked up, went to Sundance. It got picked up by Sony and got released theatrically. I got an agent. So it really started the ball rolling for me. And we followed that up with the first 24 PhD feature that was released in the United States called Jackpot. This was the time in 2000 when the tail end of the DV, the Dogma 95 craze, when everyone was going out with a DV camera and making a feature. Chuck and Buck and the anniversary party.
Didn't Dogma 95 have like a certain amount of, like, there were like rules, right?
Yeah, there was actually no rule to shoot it in DV.
But there were like rules of that style that you had to like hit, right?
Yeah, to be a Dogma 95, you couldn't art direct the film. You couldn't bring props. You couldn't light it. All sorts of things. But there was no rule that it had to be video or DV. But this was the sort of tail end of that craze, and people were starting to look into, how do I shoot a film digitally, but make it look a little better? Not quite so low tech looking. So you had the anniversary party came out, which John Bailey shot, which was shot on PAL DV cam on a slightly better camera, and it was PAL, so it could transfer to film easier than NTSC video. And so I looked into that camera, but it turns out there was only one on the West Coast. I started looking into PAL Betacam because I had experience with Betacam. I thought, well, if it's PAL, we could transfer Betacam to film. Turns out PAL Betacam was twice as expensive to rent in LA than NTSC Betacam. So I looked in all the video rental catalogs, and I started seeing high definition video cameras for rent. And the NTSC 1080i camcorder rented for the same price as a PAL Betacam. And I was like, well, we could shoot this in high definition for the same price as shooting PAL resolution.
And was that because like at this time video cameras were all interlaced? Is that?
Yeah, they're all interlaced, and generally you bought rental house either by an NTSC or a PAL. They weren't switchable. They only sold them in either 25i or 30i. So I was about to bite the bullet on shooting the movie in 1080i interlace, and the 24p HD cam came out in 2000 for George Lucas shooting Attack of the Clones, the second Star Wars film. And this company in Canada called Sim Video bought a bunch of them because they were trying to promote television to switch over from film to 24p. And so there was a Canadian shot TV show called Earth Final Conflict that they bought a bunch of Sony F900s for. And then they brought one down to LA to show to television producers this camera. And so the Polish brothers, a lot of the actors in Polish brothers films acted in The Pretender, which was a show at the time. And the DP on that, Rodney Charters, was testing all these. He was shooting, at the time, he'd switched from The Pretender to Roswell, and the Roswell was a Super 16 show. So he was considering switching from Super 16 to 24p HD. So Sim brought down the camera for him. He tested it. I went to his test to see the results, and I thought, well, this looks better than interlace scan, 24p, and it would transfer to film, and it looked very film-like. So I went to Sim Video, and I said, what are you doing with this camcorder that you brought down? He goes, oh, it goes back up in 3 weeks for this TV show. And I go, well, next week I'm about to start shooting a 12-day indie film. If you just leave the camera here for next couple of weeks, I'll shoot a whole feature on it. And you'll have a feature shot on this camera. And then we went to Post Group, and they had never done a 24p HD post. And they said, okay, we'll provide the post for free just to learn how to do 24p post. Then we got a deal for the film out from, I think, Deluxe Labs and or eFilm. And then so we went out and shot this whole feature. And I didn't have much of a learning curve because I'd been shooting Betacam for infomercials and EPKs on less spare time because features weren't paying very well. And so I turned on the Sony F900 and went to the menu system. I realized it was a Sony Betacam. It just did 24p. So I didn't have any trouble using it. Our whole film was a road trip film with Garrett Morris and John Grice. So I had a black actor and a white actor in a car the whole movie. So that was my main concern, was how can this camera handle difference in skin tones. So that's my only test, was to shoot two people against a white wall and a dark wall and see how well. And it wasn't, it wasn't great, but it wasn't bad either. It was, the dynamic range was okay. I could handle it, and with some minimal lighting. And we went out and had a lot of fun doing this film, and then it got picked up for theatrical. It went to Sundance again. It got released in the theaters, and I think it was August of 2001, which beat Star Wars out by 9 months. Star Wars came out, Attack of the Clones came out in May of 2002. So we were the first U.S. theatrical release of a 24p HD feature. And then 2 weeks later, a film called Session 9, a horror film that Uda Brieskowitz shot, was the second one to get released theatrically.
Oh, wow.
But because of that, the next 4 years, I got asked to do every 24p HD indie film. I did like 7 of them or so. And but finally I joined the union around 2003 with my 23rd feature. I did this film Northfork with the Polish brothers, our third film, in 2002, which was a wonderful project. It was 35 millimeter anamorphic. It was a period film in Montana, big widescreen landscape film, very moody. It was a dream project. I spent 2 years waiting for it to happen because they kept trying to finance it and it would fall through, and it had to be shot. It is an all-day exterior film. There's no night scenes, but it's all a winter landscape film. But in Montana in winter, there's only 8 hours of light or so. So we couldn't actually shoot it in December or so. We had to shoot it when there was snow, but when there was still some more like November or April or, when there was longer daylight hours. So fall would roll around and I'd stop taking job interviews and stop looking for work. And then I'd go out and prep with them and suddenly they lose the financing and they go, okay, it'll be next spring. So by February, I start turning down work again and it didn't happen. Next fall, didn't happen. Next spring finally happened.
For 2 years?
For 2 years. And finally, when it did happen, it was still paid $1,000 a month, so a week. So 5-week job, I got $5,000 for waiting 2 years for. But that film, also, it not only got a theatrical release from Paramount and went to Sundance, but it got me into the ASC because several ASC members saw it in film festivals and called me up and wanted to meet me and talk about it. And
so you got into the ASC before you joined 600?
Right, the same year. Yeah, because the fourth Polish Brothers film was going to be a union film. They were going to do this film Hollywoodland that ended up being made with Ben Affleck in it about George Reeves, and Miramax was going to produce that. So I joined the union. At the time, I didn't have any trouble joining the union. I had 23 features.
Yeah, I mean,
you had the credits.
I had the hours, and I was lucky. They're all handled by one payroll company. So all I needed was one letter from the payroll company showing that I'd worked as a DP. I had plenty of hours. So I joined, but then the film didn't happen. But around that same time, I was meeting with ASC members, and the three of them wrote letters of recommendation for me. It was Roy Wagner, Denis Lenoir, and Robert Prime. So I got in the ASC and the union about the same time.
Can you talk a little bit about what the ASC is? Like why that's a big deal to get into?
It's sort of a dream for any cinematographer. It's an honorary society. It's not a union. The local 600 IATSE is the union, but it's the oldest honorary society in the film industry. It goes back to 1918. You can only get in by invitation. It's for people who exhibit, certain level of work, basically. Tends to be skewed older because they, to do that kind of level of work, there tends to take years of experience and working. And so it tends to be studio people. So I was, very lucky to get in as early as I did. I'd already published a cinematography textbook at this point with Chris Malkiewicz, my professor at CalArts. His third edition of cinematography in, I think it was around 2001 or so. He didn't want to update it to himself. He had already done the 80s update of his 70s book, and he felt he needed someone who was working currently to update it again. So I did the update on it. So it's about
the 24p guy. So
yeah. Well, it's geared towards a 16 millimeter workshop at CalArts. So it's a film. It's not digital. It's all about film, 16 millimeter film. But so I rewrote about a third of it, and updated another third, and another third didn't really change at all. But it was a good experience working on a textbook. And so I'd already done that and written articles for American Cinematographer on my indie films with the Polish Brothers. So a lot of cinematographers by this point had sort of knew me, and actually remembered in being invited to the ASC Clubhouse before I was a member. They used to do these Monday evening dinners where they would do a presentation and a dinner. And one of the presentations was on pre-visualization, from storyboarding to previs. And they had heard that I'd storyboarded all the Polish Brothers films. So I brought in a demonstration of my storyboards and the clips that matched the storyboards. And I talked about how I did the film and stuff. So yeah, so I was at the Clubhouse for that. So
you already had a reputation in there, sort of. Before
little bit, yeah. I co-edited the 11th edition of the American Cinematographer Manual, but I wrote an article for the 10th edition about DV and transferring it to film and all the issues for it. So for Michael Goy, the editor, that manual wanted me to write something about independent filmmaking using digital video. So and I wrote this article, and it was, at the time, all the issues were about transferring to film, like how do you take 60i interlace and convert it to 24 frame, and what sort of processes there existed at the time to do that, what companies were doing it. Swiss Effects, I think, in Europe, and Sony had an imaging center that had an image transform process. It was all different. They're all various versions of pointing a camera to CRT screen, to transfer the image over. But the frame rate was constantly an issue. So now with 24p came along with the F900 and then the Sony VariCam, like a few months after that, they both did very strange recording formats. It wasn't just 24 frames on a piece of videotape, because the F900 had a format called PSF, which was progressive segmented frames. So the 24 frames were then split into 48 fields, so they could still show on a CRT monitor from the camera.
Oh, wow.
But then in post, you had to recombine it. When you played it back, it would recombine it into progressive, basically, for a progressive monitor or so. And the VariCam recorded everything to 60p. So whatever frame rate you shot on the VariCam, it would add frames to add up to 60. So you would have a 60p recording on the tape for the VariCam. So they're all, complicated in their own ways, but they're all trying to deal with the whole legacy of NTSC. And
these were shot on like HD cam tapes, right?
Yeah. It was all tape based. That was a Wild West days of digital, and soon after doing several HD cam features, and HD cam was not a great tape format. It wasn't even 422. It was 311 color space, color subsampling. It was very compressed.
Yeah.
So, you had compression artifacts, you had some color issues from that. So I was trying to get away from HD cam after several features, if I was going to stick to video. And so I started looking into the next generation of cameras, which was the Sony Viper. Not the Sony, but the Thompson Viper.
Yeah. That was the camera they used on
Collateral and Miami Vice and
was the
Benjamin
Fincher
Button.
movie.
Benjamin Button and Zodiac.
Zodiac, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So there's several features shot on it. The trouble that at that time was that they called it raw recording, but it wasn't. It was an early log camera, and what Thompson Viper called raw was really just a log with minimal adjustments to it. So it was kind of a flat log image, but there was no recording the camera had no recording format. It had no deck in it or anything like that. So you had to send the signal out to a data recorder, these big boxes called DFRs, digital field recorders, and you need 3 or 4 of them. Back then there wasn't tiny little drives. There's these big boxes, and then you have to send those to the Pote House, and they would take overnight to try to unload them. So you would need extra back on set before the unloaded one would show back at you. And so I went in all this research. I was going to do an independent film with one, and between needing multiple DFRs for post and for me, and then they always said, "What are you going to do with the data?" And I go, "What do you mean?" He goes, "We're not going to hold the post ops. Like, what? We don't want to hold on to terabytes of data on our own. So they said, we can put it on the tape for you." And I go, "Well, that sort of defeats the whole purpose. I wanted to avoid tape." But they said, "Well, you just can't park it on our computer for the next 9 months of post or whatever." So there was no big hard drive systems back then. So
yeah, this is like when the 1 terabyte drive was like a big deal.
Yeah.
So
still costs $400.
So the method back then was to transfer the data to LTO tapes. So, we'd have to then budget for an LTO tape for every, and they were quite expensive, these tapes. So by the time I was done adding up all the numbers, and it had to be done in LA because of the turnaround on the drives, and I just gave up. I just said...
At a point, is it just like cheaper to shoot film?
But for that, it starts to be, although this film was a heavy dialogue-driven multi-camera thing with a bunch of people around a table, so it seemed natural to shoot this digitally. Just to get, it was a fairly low budget film. I didn't want to shoot miles of film for it, but I gave up, went back to the F900 for that film. Eventually, Sony came out with the HDCam SR tape format, which was tied to the Panavision Genesis camera, which was the next generation 35 millimeter single sensor 444 recording log, panel log. So that was the next big step by 2005, 2006 with Superman Returns and
Was that CMOS or was
no,
that
it's a
3 CCD?
CCD. No, it was single.
Oh, okay.
You know, everyone was trying to get away from
Because
the 2/3 inch.
The Viper was the CCD, right? There was like 3 sensor.
Yeah, all the camcorders up to that point were all 2/3 inch. You know, and a 2/3 inch sensor is smaller than 16 millimeter. It's like 16 millimeter is like 11, 12 millimeters wide. A 2/3 inch sensor is 10 millimeters wide. So,
and they had to have 3 because that's the color channels,
yeah,
right?
They
so RGB.
they had a prism behind the lens, and it would split the light 3 ways, the 3 sensors, a little like a Technicolor camera in a way. So you had 3 CCDs through filters recording the red, green, and blue information, and then that would get recorded to tape in some subsampled format. So the Viper was also a 3 CCD camera, just like the F900, but it was a better sensor. It actually had some unique qualities. It could do widescreen in a way that the way it scanned the chip. But the limitations with 2/3 inch were, you know, the extra depth of field. You had 2.5 steps more depth of field with a 10 millimeter wide sensor. So everyone was trying to, at that time, developing fast prime lenses for the F900 and the Viper so they could get shallow focus as best they could. You know, you have to, if you shot at 2, it would look like a, you know, 4, 5, 6 split, basically, if you shot 35 millimeters.
Just
so,
because of the size of
sensor size, and which affects the focal lengths. The focal lengths are, you know, smaller, shorter, so there's more depth of field. So there was all this push to try to make a 35 millimeter digital camera, but no one wanted to build a 3 sensor 35 millimeter camera because it'd be gigantic. You know, 3 giants, like a Technicolor camera. Again, it'd be, you know, 3 35 sensors. So the goal was to make a single sensor 35 camera. So this was the early days of the Bayer filter idea. The Genesis camera, which was the first, actually didn't use a Bayer filter. It was kind of a unique idea. It was a striped sensor. So it had red, green, and blue stripes on the sensor, in front of the sensor. So it'd be red, green, and blue, and then it stood red, green, and blue. And it was a 6K sensor so that each color could get 2K per color. So essentially, it could only do HD or 2K essentially because there was 2K of red and 2K of green and 2K of blue, but there was full 2K of each color, unlike a Bayer filter, which is 50% green and 25% red and 25% blue. So there were certain advantages to the Genesis camera in terms of color. Now there are certain other artifacts, so there were certain issues with aliasing. It's hard to design an anti-aliasing filter when your red stripe is 2 stripes away from the next red stripe, and so you tend to get chroma moire patterns with chroma colors and things. Chroma moire. So otherwise, but it was a good camera, and Sony had actually built it. So they'd made a deal with Panavision that for the first 2 years, Panavision had exclusive rights to it, and then they would put out the F35, which was their version of the Genesis, with certain tweaks that they were able to do 2 years later. But it was all out of my budget range in a way. And I was, at this point, by the mid-2000s, I was back to shooting film again because my budgets had climbed from under $1 million or $2 million to now $3 to $4 to $5 million. And now we could afford to shoot film again. So I shot film through the mid-2000s. And then when I got into television, first was Big Love, which was shot on film. After Big Love, I did the United States of Terror for Showtime, and that was digital, and we shot with the Genesis camera. By this point, the Genesis camera was affordable for television, and it was an interesting experience because, first of all, the pilot had been shot by Udo Brieswitz in 35 millimeter because Spielberg produced the show for DreamWorks. And he insisted on shooting the pilot on film. But Showtime was like, well, okay, you can shoot the pilot on film, but you can't shoot the series on film. So then when I got called to an interview for the show, the first thing they said is, how is this going to look like film? And I said, well, don't shoot with a 2/3 inch camcorder, shoot with a 35 sensor camera, get a Genesis camera or the F35. So I shot the series on the Genesis camera. But I had issues with Showtime at the time. Oddly enough, Whereas most studios were sort of behind the times in terms of DIs and digital technology, Showtime was one of the first to embrace HD. They had done the L Word and these shows on the F900 and these cameras. So I had the opposite problem with them. They were so used to camcorder-based shows where you would shoot Rec 709, deliver a color. They had a colorist on set, engineer, and color correct weeds and these shows live, and then deliver color corrected dailies. It was on tape, more or less finished already.
Oh, wow.
So their post budget for dailies and for post was smaller because on set they were more or less tweaking it in camera and with a color box. But I was telling them, no, the future is not Rec 709. The future is more like film. We need a flat log image that we have more dynamic range, and then we can create more of a film look with that. But, they didn't want to spend the money on color correcting dailies, and I was trying to develop a LUT, so I could just do it with a basic LUT for dailies. But the early days of LUTs even, some of the post houses had systems to add LUTs to dailies, but a lot of them didn't. So what happened was I developed a LUT, and Panavision at the time had a separate box called the for the GFR or something. It was basically a LUT box, and it loaded into that box and run the signal out of the camera to the monitors. And then Post House said, well, we need that box there too. So Panavision's called me up and said, every show we have right now, we have to have two of these boxes. They have to one per camera, and the Post House wants a box too to get the LUT onto the dailies. And so Panavision was renting out more of these boxes they intended to, because it wasn't something they could just put in the camera. It had to be the separate box in the cart and one per camera. And so it was these early days, So the first season of United States of Terror, I shot in Panalog. Second season, Showtime came back and says, we can't afford Panalog. We got to shoot at Rec 709 in camera. And so I said, okay. And I tried to develop a flat Rec 709 that I could color correct a little bit with, a version of Hyper Gamma, which is what Sony had, their version of. But I had certain limitations in color correction because now I was stuck in Rec 709. So the third season came along, and I said, I don't want to do Rec 709 again. How much was it costing you to shoot log in the first season? And they said, it was costing us $1,000 an episode. And I go, that's it? $1,000 an episode? I said, that doesn't make any sense. As the whole look is compromised to save $1,000 an episode. And so finally the post price says, look, we'll find $1,000 in our budget to shoot log again. So third season we shot
that's why
analog. So, but like I said, these are all the early days, and within a few years they had the red one come out, and then the red Epic and the Alexa, and
yeah, there was an Alexa before that original studio Alexa, right? It was like the D21 or
yeah, there was a D21 in the days of the Genesis. And a few features were shot on it and stuff. But again, it had no recording format. So the only way to use it was either attach it to a Sony HDCam SR deck. There's like a field deck they had made, or a digital field recorder of some sort. So that was the era of the OB1 and the codex box that you could put on the camera. And even when Game of Thrones started up on the Alexa, their first few seasons, they didn't record internally to ProRes. They recorded uncompressed RGB HD out of the camera into codex boxes. So the first few seasons were uncompressed 1920 by 1080 RGB, so they could do post visual effects and all these sort of things. And that was because at the time the Alexa wasn't really enabled to do raw recording yet, Arri RAW internally. And so that was the best quality you could get, was uncompressed HD, which is how Roger Deakins shot In Time. That his first Alexa movie too was shot that way. But within a year or two, Arri RAW was enabled in the camera, and codecs had boxes to do Arri RAW and all that sort of thing. So this is all the early
it's like
10s,
a mishmash
2011.
of just like
trial and error for the best color. How about like your lighting? How did your lighting change, I guess, from when you went like doing film to digital? Like, what was that transition for you? Like, did you start looking at things differently because you had to work with like different sort of camera systems and different like color considerations?
Well, when the F900 came out, it was a roughly 320, 400 ASA camera, so it was on the same sensitivity as 35 high-speed film. So I basically lit jackpot like I would a low-budget, film with Kino flows and small, lights and HMIs when I need to light a night exterior or something like that. So it was no difference in the lighting package for me. Other than the extra depth of field from the smaller sensor. But there were certain things you could do. You could boost the gain and low light. With film, you could push film, but the quality starts to fall off because you're not increasing the sensitivity of the film. You're just taking what gets captured on the silver and giving it more density. So your contrast goes up, graininess goes up because the biggest grains on the film are the first to get exposed to light. So when you underexpose the film, the smaller grains get washed away in processing because they weren't exposed enough. So you end up with this grainier image. With digital, when you boost the signal, you get more noise, but its noise is different than grain. So you could boost the camera to 1000 ASA fairly easily, easier than you could with film. And so I would occasionally get to some low light stuff where I'd push the camera and it'd be noisy, but it was a way. It didn't increase contrast with film. You push the film 2 stops, it has a certain look. If the shadows fall off quickly and things like that. With digital, it didn't happen. You could push it 2 stops and it would get noisy, but it wouldn't get harsher looking or something. So there were certain things I could do differently, but mostly I shot it the way I'd been doing my independent films. And I remember we transferred Jackpot to film and Deluxe Labs printed it. And Beverly Woods at Deluxe came into the screening room and she said, "My God, you lit it like film." I go, "Well, lighting is lighting. I don't even know what it means to light digitally. It just, to me, light is light. You want a soft light through a window, you create a soft light through a window. You want backlight, you add backlight. There's no real difference between film and digital in that aspect other than the dynamic range issues where you have to watch out for clipping and things like that, or color clipping. But for the most part, I never treated film and digital differently in terms of lighting from the early days on. So
did it change the way that you did camera movements at all? Like was that kind of like the benefit of moving to a smaller camera or anything like that?
Yeah, I mean, there were certain things that changed for me. One was I was always a meticulous user of light meter when I was shooting film. I wanted to deliver a negative that would print exactly at the same set of printer lights, like Gordon Willis. I wanted the colorist to not have to fix anything. So I was very meticulous about exposing. With digital, I got used to lighting by eye and then by looking at a monitor. So it was a little more organic way of lighting than taking my meter out and checking the shadow side of you and the key side and that wall back there. And, that wall, it's like 4 stops under. Maybe I need to throw a little light on that wall. But on a digital, I'd see, that's fine. I wouldn't sweat stuff if I could see that I had the information there. Mm-hmm. Robert Primes used to say that your eyes make you brave and your meter makes you a coward. And so I sort of learned from that. But when I went back to film again, shooting digital had changed my style of exposing and lighting because I learned that film, I could light film the way my eyes see it and it would come out fine. I didn't have to sweat over metering everything, It's sort of thing where I learned that if the lighting looked off to my eye and was right on my meter, it would still be off in the final results, So the meter can give you inaccurate sensation about things, but you have to
also I feel like the meter, like I don't know, maybe in film school it wasn't really taught to me that well. I had to learn it myself, but the meter is middle gray. It's not really what
you have to interpret your meter readings, and I've learned because film likes exposure. I tend to be very conservative. I print at high printer lights, have a dense negative. It would project, print would be really rich and clean looking. But when you start shooting digitally and you go by what it looks right on the monitor, you start realizing how often you don't expose things fully. Like in a living room scene at night with the lamps on, people might be at full exposure when they're 2 feet from a lamp, but as soon as they're 6 feet from that lamp, what looks natural is for them to be about a stop and a half or 2 stops under, you know, and on your meter go, oh, everyone's 2 stops under here, but actually it looks right projected or because that's what's naturally would happen. People don't always walk around in full key lighting. Right. So digital kind of taught me in a way to let things go and just let people move around and fall off and come back into their key and stuff. But even when I shot film and I was more conservative about exposing, I still had to interpret my meter reading. I always thought of it as how many over, under, or middle. Like if someone's under a bright fluorescent light, they should feel hotter. So I may take a meter reading and I'd open up a half stop or a stop for that feeling. And if they're in bright sunlight, same thing. Like, well, the sun's hitting their face, they shouldn't be at key, they should be a half or a stop over key. So I tended to think of a stop over, a stop under, or things like that, or 1.5 stops under. Even when I was metering, you know, I'd look at a face and I'd say, well, they're in the shadow, that should be at least 2 stops under, you know, things like that. But with digital, I started realizing how rarely someone was at full exposure, basically. So yeah, it changed some of my approach to lighting in terms of exposure, but lighting is still lighting. If you want it to look like a Rembrandt, you got to light it like a Rembrandt. If you want it to look like a Technicolor movie, you got to light it like that. It's the format doesn't matter so much other than your light level you need and your dynamic range the camera can handle. In terms of camera movement, you know, in the early F900 days, I had a friend, a director's friend, who was doing a lot of Betacam kind of children's shows and things. And he used to complain about film, saying, I wish I could shoot a film like this, like put a camera on my shoulder and run around and zoom in and just get shot after shot. That's the way he was shooting his Betacam stuff. And of course you could do that. It's more of a philosophy than a technical problem. You could shoot Super 16 with a zoom lens.
The Eclair camera.
You know, right. And shoot in that style of a Betacam style. But when the F900 came out and Hollywood was switching over to digital, everyone was trying to take that F900 and make it into a 35 camera. You know, we need a bigger viewfinder and brighter monitors, and we need this, you know, beef it up and bigger lenses. And the camera became, because everything they added seemed to add to the length of it. By the time they were done, the camera was like panning a 2x4 on a tripod, you know. The batteries would be out here and the front end would be out here. And I was just constant like, isn't there a way we could assemble this so that things stacked vertically when I needed to? Like, why does everything have to be added onto the back end of these cameras? But I tended to shoot my F900 films with a zoom lens instead of primes. I said, well, we're going to shoot on a Betacam. We should just approach it like an ENG show. We should just keep it light, have one lens, one zoom lens, shoot everything, light everything for that lens. And then I would grab all the coverage with the zoom and instead of trying to treat it like a film camera in terms of the camera style, not the lighting, but the camera style. But once we got into the 35 sensor cameras, the language became more traditional in a way. And the, you know, Genesis was not a small camera, but similar in 35 to 35 cameras in weight and stuff. So with the HRSR deck on the back and all that sort of thing, you could take the deck off and camera system could wear it as a backpack and follow the Steadicam operator with a cable, which sometimes is how we did things with the Genesis camera.
It's like the Venice cam now.
Yeah. And I learned, you know, there were certain things you could do that were a problem with back then. The Genesis, when you detached, or even when you attached the deck, there was a little BNC cable to connect to the deck to the camera itself. And the back of that camera had 2 outputs. One was a monitor only out, and one was recording out. Oh, and if you connected to the monitor out, you would record frame lines, crosshairs, battery information into the actual. So I would get, once I got a call from the post house saying, you just went out and did a big Steadicam sequence in the street and you've got all the menu information in the recording. Luckily, I hadn't turned the crosshairs on, so we could like zoom in past the frame and crop some of it out. But it was just like, why put 2 BNC outs right next to each other in the back of the camera and have to remember one is the one that goes to record and the other one goes to monitor.
On Sony cameras. There's one that I remember, there's an out on, I think, the Venice that is baked. Like it has the LUT baked into
Oh.
it. And you're like, oh, you plugged it in the wrong thing. It's like, this is it.
Yeah.
That's like one of, cinematographer's worst nightmares is getting a call. It's like, yeah, the footage is fucked up pretty much. Like,
Yeah.
did you ever have to deal with that, like working with film, like in any of your early days, like getting calls from the labs?
Yeah, things go wrong with film. In fact, other than this bug with, recording the wrong thing, or with early days digital, the other problem was not hitting the record button at all. You hit it twice, but you'd hit it and the AC would hit it and you'd shut each other off. And then you do the whole scene and someone said, you never recorded, because there's no film camera noise to tell you you're rolling, right? So the early days of HD, you had to like double check the monitor. Is the record light on? Are we actually recording? Because occasionally like not had a take recorded. And it still can happen even with Alexa, So you have to know you're rolling. With film, you always hear the camera rolling, so you kind of know when you're rolling and not rolling. The trouble with film is that when things go wrong with film, like a scratch or something, it's very hard to track down where the problem came from. The lab blames the camera assistants blame the camera blames the lab, and you go, oh, I don't care who scratched it, but it's got scratched, and it's like you swap out the mags, you swap out the gate or the body or the lab. You tracking down these problems is just a nightmare, because you have digital dailies or, back then. So you'd end up having to print the stuff and project it in the lab, make sure it's not on the original negative and things like that. I remember when I did Big Love, which was shot in film, we had a day where the Preston follow focus was acting up. It was getting these weird hits, and occasionally it would suddenly lose focus. And, we fixed the Preston, but I'm looking at dailies carefully, and I start noticing this focus flutter. Like every 5 or 6 frames, the picture would just go blurry for a second. And I would like, is the Preston doing that? Is the Preston wiggling the focus slightly every now and then, like some weird hit? And so I printed the scene and I projected, and I couldn't find the problem. And then I was like, well, now is it the transfer of because we color correct from a video transfer, is our masters? So I had to go to the post house and then look at the masters, and I didn't see it there. And it turns out it was just our dailies, our DVD dailies. The DVD compression was so high that it would, every 5th frame, it would overcompress. So the image would just get blurred in a kind of rhythmic way, but you had to really stare at the TV screen to see it. But I had just been ultra paranoid since having that day with problem with the Preston. I was looking closely at dailies, and then I was seeing this blur, unblur thing, and turns out it was just DVD compression.
So this was like a video tap that you're recording off the tap, correct?
No, this is, they would take the film and they would telecine it, and then from the telecine master, they would convert it down to DVD for redistribution the next day. So these DVDs made from the telecine master.
Got it.
What's telecine?
It's just a film to video transfer, just a scanner,
Got it.
The telecine's run in real time, so they thread it up, the film up, and it runs through the telecine in 24 frames per second, and you color correct live while it's going through, or you stop it and color correct and roll it. Scanners generally don't run in real time. They're pin registered, and they scan a frame, they take a couple seconds per frame or whatever. So they, until recently, for video dailies of film, you had to use a telecine, and then they would scan it later for the DI. Now scanners have gotten faster, and a lot of post houses just do a one-time only scan where they scan everything at 4K and make dailies from that scan. But several years ago, a decade ago, that you had an Arri scanner that ran at non-real time, or you had a Spirit telecine or something that ran in real time, and so you'd have to transfer everything twice, once for the dailies and then again for the final DI. So
I don't think I've ever heard anybody talk about how much watching dailies actually adds to their day. Like if you're doing a 14-hour day on set, are you spending like another 4 hours watching everything?
Well,
every
with
day?
film, with digital, I don't, because you see it live, and assuming it was recorded, everything is fine. I would, a current show, I get dailies. We get dailies and we get stills from the dailies. So I find that more useful. I get the stills from every setup from the dailies colorist, from our masters, and then I put them into a file folder on my phone so I can quickly pull up a frame from every setup. That's the actual original. And the DIT also still keeps frames too, but I have it from dailies. But with film dailies, you have to look at it because that's your original. And if it's something screwed up, you have to know if it has to be reshot. And often you get a negative report, from the lab saying this is scratched or this was out of focus or things like that. Whoever's doing dailies will make notes and send the notes back to you. And then you look at dailies and check for everything. So yeah, there's a lot of time spent watching dailies. Although my first 3 features were before, right in the early days of the Avid. And so I think my first 2 films were cut on film with work print. And I found that really useful to actually print everything every day and go to the lab and project it, because I would see everything on a big screen. And I learned exposure and everything very meticulous because I'd see everything, filtering, but that was in the early days of the Avid in the 90s. Then dailies would be VHS, and then went from VHS to DVD. So NTSC video, and they weren't very sharp. So, after my first 2 films, everything went to VHS dailies, which looked terrible. And I had no idea if I was shooting was actually exactly that or not. And I had to just go by experience. The experience I got from my first 2 films, printing everything, I could then apply for the next decade looking at bad video dailies.
Wow.
The trick on indie films was to print things now and then. You'd print the first day's dailies and project it and look at it. And then every, in 2 weeks, you might print a shot here and there you're not sure about, or you tell the producer, look, I really want to print this camera roll, and double check things again. That was your only, until you got to the final edit and the master and the answer printing, you often didn't know exactly how the negative looked.
So there's just days where you're going blind,
Well, you see video dailies. It's just they would be fuzzy and often flatly transferred. Colorists generally had a rule with video dailies, which was no whites above 90 and no blacks below 10 IRE. So everything would be kind of flattened down a little bit, no matter how many notes you sent them. Again, when I started out doing these straight-to-video thrillers, B-movie stuff, they were all films that were finished and basically answer printed, and then we'd make a color-corrected IP and then transfer that to video for home video mastering. And they were generally sold to European television. And they had very strict standards in Germany, for example, about nothing clipped, and nothing could look clipped. Like, they didn't want to see any detail lost in highlights and stuff like that. So it was very conservative in terms of lighting. I was not allowed to have lens flares in the shot, things like that. Nothing could be too hot or too dark. So that tends to be a little bit boring in terms of the cinematography. Although it did force me to learn to be very technically, again, precise, because I knew it'd get rejected by German television if I had this or that. But one of the things I started learning was this was, again, a problem with doing low-budget films, is that the telecines of the time, some of them had an auto knee function. So essentially, you could roll off highlights. So if you had a bright fluorescent tube in the shot, it would do a knee compression on that thing, so to keep it from clipping or up to the clip points, only the white part of the tube would be clipped. If you didn't have knee compression setting in the telecine and in the color corrector, you could only set the overall level of the image, right? So if I had a bright fluorescent in the shot, I'd have to set the transfer level for that fluorescent, because I'd have to set, that fluorescent at 100 ARE, and everything below that would be whatever fell at that level. So I was like, well, the whole shot looks dark.
Yeah.
Because I can't, if I had knee,
it's like auto exposing for the brightest point.
If with knee compression, I could take the last 10 IRE and flatten the curve like a log curve effect. And so I could color correct everything below it a certain way, and then just compress the knee down to where I could keep it legal. So I started having trouble in telecine suites with scenes, and I finally said, what's going on with, and it goes, well, this telecine doesn't have knee compression. And so then I'd have to go to the producer and say, no, you got to book these telecine rooms based on what they offer. But a lot of the post houses back then weren't very clear about that. We have 6 telecines here. You're now at telecine 4, and you'd find out telecine 4 didn't have the same features as telecine 6 or something like that. So you have to start memorizing the features in every room and tell, like, you got to book it in telecine suite 6 because they have this feature. And it was, those were tough times, basically.
Yeah.
It's a lot easier now.
It's part of like the meticulousness that you had to pick up and like knowing. I mean, it sounds like you're really guiding the image basically from production until, post essentially. Was it common for you to always be working in color? Was that something that you kind of always asked for? Because I don't know that every DP gets to work in color on their projects. Or is that something that's just standardized when it comes to features? Or
Well, it should be. In commercial world, often the director and the DP aren't involved in the final color correcting. The clients take it away. But for most independent films, television, generally they try to keep the DP involved in the loop. And I always tried to be there for the final coloring and mastering, not just the answer printing, but then the final transfer to video. It became an issue with, in the ASC and the union because we don't get paid often for this time. And in the early days of film, it became a tradition because answer printing, was a real-time thing. So let's say you did 3 answer prints. So it's a 2-hour movie. So you go in and watch for 2 hours and stop and start. So maybe it's a 3-hour session for a 2-hour movie. And you do it 2 more times over the course of 2 weeks or something. So you'd volunteer your time for free. Then came along home video, and you'd say, okay, now I need 2 days or 3 days in a telecine suite to transfer this movie on top of the 2 or 3 weeks of color correcting the answer print. Okay, that's fine. Then DIs came along, and suddenly it was 10 days in a DI suite. And you're starting to go like, I'm in a room for 10 days surrounded by people who are getting paid to be here. The editor's here, the director, the colorist, they're all getting paid, but I'm the only person in this room who's not being paid for 10 days to sit here and do this work. So,
Jeez.
But if you didn't do it, then you weren't in control of the image, so you'd do it anyway. But and it's just still an issue. If you can, your agent will negotiate to basically get you paid for your post time. So
Right. Because it's your name. You
do it anyway, whether you get paid for it or not. But ideally, you get paid for your time. Now with television, because there's so many more episodes and hours, and it's harder to find the time. I still supervise everything I shoot for television, but it's more a faster system where essentially the colorist does a pass without me, and then I'll screen it and then give him notes based on that pass. And so an hour-long episode may take 2 or 3 hours of time, but
all remote, sort of.
Well, now it's, it used to be I'd go into the post house, but it's become remote because I live in LA and our current show is in New York. So it'd be color correct New York. First episode, I'm still in New York shooting. Might be in town to color correct. Otherwise, I'm back in LA. So it's a live session, but streaming, we basically remote. And then COVID came along and everything went remote for a while, even in town. So that's become more common. I don't like remote color correcting because there's always this assumption that we're looking at the same image, well, we've calibrated the monitors remotely to match, but it's like until you're actually looking at the same monitor together, it's really hard to trust that
absolutely.
your monitor is the same as their monitor and you're seeing the same things.
And in like a color suite, the room and like the lighting is like controlled to a certain
green walls.
Yeah, I mean, you could be like watching it right here. Your eyes are going to be dilated differently. Your colors are going to look different.
Yeah, and whether it's a plasma screen or LCD screen or big screen DI theater, it's all, your reactions are different. And there's a lot of psychological issues with color correcting that, that one is your eyes get tired. Like if I have a sequence that's all in blue moonlight, I'll have the colorist save a few day exterior shots and have them in the frame store. And every couple minutes, I'll have just flash up a neutral scene. Like I just want to see something that's not blue, because I've been staring at blue lighting for so long that what happens is your eyes neutralize the blue, and you start adding blue in. You go, oh, there's not enough blue here, so you add some more blue in. But then as soon as you put up a neutral shot, you realize you've made everything super blue, because your brain has slowly filtered out the blue. So you have to step away now and then to rebalance your eyeballs.
It's like cleansing your palate.
Yeah, similar
Smelling
to
the coffee
that.
beans.
And then there's also, when you're talking about scenes that are dark, for example, Alan Davia once said that he always color corrected to a answer print with the sound on it, because usually the first answer print is silent, and then the second answer print would be composite with an optical track on it. But he found that he had to color correct with the sound, because when you get to very dark scenes that are silent, everything looks too dark, because your brain needs information. So you're watching just the silent stuff of people running through this moonlit basement or whatever it is, dark, and all you can think of is, I can't see anything, it's just dark. But as soon as you hear it with the soundtrack, you hear footsteps, you hear creakings, you hear birds, whatever you hear, your brain thinks you're seeing more than you are, because the sound is creating a world that your brain can fill in all the gaps with the audio. So the scene looks less dark with sound on it, which is an odd psychological effect, but it's true. So when you're doing a dark movie, it's really useful to hear it with the soundtrack, because it makes you less worried about how dark things are falling off. You could pan into a completely pitch black moment where it's just nothing, but if you hear the action for a moment, you don't sweat it, because you think, okay, I know what's going on. I hear it still, and I pan it back into light again. But in a silent print, you're just like what happened? It just went dark there. So, it's psychological. And even on set with monitors, even you work in a DIT tent, you're running inside and outside, or outside and inside. I sort of learned that if you're doing very dark scenes, you have to be wary of underexposing by monitor too much, because what happens is, if you're working in a dark environment and you go into a dark room, the monitor is actually a light source. It's like staring into a lamp. So your brain goes, oh, the scene's too bright, and you start underexposing it to make it look right to your eyes. And then you get dailies back the next day, and everything looks really dark. And you go, why does it look so dark? Oh, now I'm looking at dailies in a room with lighting on, and everything looks too dark. So, and it's the same thing with day exteriors. You do day exteriors, you go to your monitor, and the monitor now looks too dim. So you start overexposing so everything feels like it's daylight brightness. And then you get dailies back, and everything is too bright. And it's because, again, your brain is thinking that the monitor relative to the real world situation is trying to do some sort of balancing act. So now when I sit at the monitor in a car day, process trailer work or day exterior, I say, well, if things look a little dim on the monitor, actually it's about right. If it feels slightly down, and if it's a dark interior and go back to the DID monitor, I said, well, if it feels a little hot on the monitor, that's actually right. It's just, I have to tell my brain to slightly ignore what I'm seeing and make some sort of mental compensation.
Do you use any tools to do you use false color or waveforms to kind of verify that? Or
Yeah, I not too technically, but often I glance down at the false colors. That's more for continuity. I say the last shot had a lot of the purple in it, or this was going green, and and I'd sort of get a feel for the tonal range on the false colors. And so when I start covering, I go that shirt was always going deep blue. So maybe I should, try to expose it or light it so it's still deep blue, so but also you save frames from every setup. So you often click back and forth to previous, go back to the master, go back to the two shot, go back to the single, or we're shooting this single. I want to see the reverse single and see how they intercut, so you get some feeling of the contrast and the difference and things like that. So they're all, again, there's the technical aspect of exposing, but a lot of it is just how it feels right to your eye, and that's why it's so useful. To me, the advantage of digital is you see it on a monitor. Now, I'm relying on a well-calibrated monitor, a good OLED monitor in a DIT tent to make judgments. I would have a hard time running around with just a little onboard monitor on my own, and because I couldn't trust that.
Yeah.
So I'd probably rely more on false colors and other tools at that point, because the monitor is no longer trustworthy.
Do you feel like there has to be a difference, but I mean, I see just the amount of monitors that are on set and the amount of people looking at the monitor on set. You must have felt that change when it was just you looking through the camera, or maybe there was one video tap that was just like for reference. And now it's like everyone can see this, everyone can have an opinion. That must affect sort of your role a little bit, no?
Yeah, it does. Although it generally has not been a problem for me. I've heard other DPs talk about this committee thing where everyone has an opinion. Maybe it's because I'm afforded some respect or something, but I've never had anything bad from a bunch of people seeing the monitor image. And generally you get compliments instead or something like that, But occasionally you'll get a note from someone, and it's actually not a bad thing to have more eyes on the image, someone, because you're staring at certain things, and then someone will catch something that you aren't catching, like the fact you're not rolling. Oh, we're not rolling? Oh, yeah. Or that's nice to know. And Marvelous Mrs. Maisel, I have this brilliant costumer, Donna Zarkowska, and she dressed Rose, or the mother, in a rose-colored bathrobe in a scene, a silk robe, and she was under a little kitchen light, and she walked by the monitor and says, "Why is that color not? It looks more red-orange, not pinkish red." And I'm like, I didn't think about it, but I said, well, the reason is because the dish lamp that's installed in this kitchen has a yellow cast to it. So no matter what light bulb I put in, it always puts more yellow out. And so the reddish robe is going towards the orange. I can't really fix that because it's practical, but in post, I will try to remember to make that robe look the shade of pink you're talking about. But it's good to make that note, because I would have known that it was, that was bothering her. But so I think more information is generally a good thing than a bad thing.
Yeah. No, I think it definitely helps with from working on movies way back, like it was like just production designers like setting up things, and I'd always see the DP have to be sort of like the judge of like what's in frame, where it's in frame, and now that everyone can have a small monitor to help their task.
Yeah, I find that part really useful was when set dressers, continuity people, all of them have a little iPad, and they're walking around, they're seeing the frame. So, they're doing things that I used to do, like move the coffee cup over a little bit or fix the curtain that's crooked or stuff that I would have to call out all the time when I was operating. They're looking for those elements too, or seeing what's not in the shot. So it's very useful, I think. And everyone's taking continuity stills off that stuff too. So you're always, someone will come back to you and show you, my iPad, this chair wasn't there in the take before or whatever, like, and it's like, when did that move, or, things like that. So it's, I think it's generally been a good thing. Because they're not coming to you with like, is that really your lighting, or is it really going to be that dark, or whatever, things like that. They're looking for their own department's issues, and so it's more useful, I think, that everyone knows what we're shooting.
So you transitioned into doing work on TV, and you were doing stuff for Big Love, and I know you also started working on like Westworld. What was that transitional period for you like, moving more into TV as opposed to film? And how did those opportunities come? Was like there another cinematographer that saw you work and asked you to work on these shows? Everyone
is sort of has to live with the times in which they enter the industry and move along. And so when I came out of film school in 91, oddly enough, that was a downturn time in the home video market. The video market exploded in the 80s. And so there are a lot of producers making straight-to-video movies with an average budget of like $2 to $3 million. All these kickboxing films and action films. And so I came out, And the market had fallen dramatically by the 90s, and producers were not making a living off these sort of films. So they suddenly cut their budgets further. And so what happened was this producer who was doing straight-to-video films said, I can't make films for $3 million anymore. I got to make them for $500,000. And I can't do action films for $500,000. So he started doing thrillers, because thrillers could be done for $500,000 to $800,000. They still had to be 35 millimeter because they had to be sold in Europe, and the broadcast standards are very high in German television and places. So he couldn't shoot Super 16, couldn't shoot video. So I came along out of film school, and whereas the market had fallen, it was an opportunity for me, because now they needed people willing to work on $500,000 movies instead of $3 million movies. So it was a chance for up-and-comers who, weren't charging much to start to work on these films. So, and by the end of the 90s, the independent market had exploded with Sundance, and studios were buying up indie films and releasing them theatrically, and they were starting their own indie divisions. Paramount Classics, Sony Picture Classics, Fox Atomic. And so just when I was starting to move into art house films, budgets were increasing, and these films had to be union because they were studio made. So I joined the union just when the studios started making union independent films.
Oh, wow.
But very quickly, within 2 or 3 years, that market collapsed because they weren't actually turning a profit on a lot of these films. They would be spending $5 to $7 million on movies that used to be made for $1 million or $2 million, but they were only getting back like $5 million in the box office, or a lot of them, or they just weren't paying for their print P&A, prints and advertising costs. So they start closing shop on those studio independent films, and the $7 to $10 million, $15 million indie films are now dropping back down to 5 to 4 to 3 by the end of the 2000s. At that same time, I was doing independent films. They'd gone union. The budget was, instead of being $2 million, was like 5 to 7. I did a number of films in that range. And then I had just done a horror film in 2005 in New Orleans for $5 million. And the producer on that horror film was friends with the producer on Big Love. And they were starting their second season. They wanted a new DP. It was a 2 DP show, but they wanted to to get a new second DP in. And they were not interested in television DPs. They wanted feature film DPs or indie features, because HBO felt the show was more like a feature look. They didn't, there's still this sort of stigma that television had a certain look to it, which was sort of not true by mid-2000s. That was true in the 70s, but by the late 80s, television cinematography, network cinematography had become very feature-like. But still, there was this kind of belief that TV DPs had one set of skills and feature DPs had another. So they called me in to interview me. And the only question was, can you handle 8-10 pages a day? And I'm like, that's the average independent, like when you do a 24-day feature or a 20-day feature, you're averaging 7 to 8 pages a day. So I said, yeah, I do that all the time on indie films. So, but I hadn't realized how quickly television worked, because I asked the AD, like, when you're on stage, how soon do you get your first shot off? And he goes, 15 to 20 minutes after call. I go, really? You block, light, shoot, and you're ready to roll 20 minutes after call? Yeah, because we have a half-hour pre-call for the actors. We rehearse before call. At call, we show everyone the rehearsal. And the night before, the director had light out the shot, and we'd already started pre-light the night before the first shot. So, yeah, we roll within 15, 20 minutes after call.
Fantasy land. And
it's like, that doesn't happen in independent world, because there's no budget for pre-calls and pre-rehearsals and all the things that television does to work fast. Indie films can't afford. So often on indie films, I can't even unlock a truck until call time, because they won't pay for the driver to be there until call time.
Yeah.
So suddenly at call time, you're laying bandit cable from the generator and you're unloading the camera carts, and they say, why aren't we rolling? It's like, we're still unloading and laying power.
Yeah.
If we had a pre-call or a pre-rig, we could be shooting faster, but they won't pay for those things in independent films. But in television, they'll pay for it if it makes them work faster. So I learned that in television, they'll spend the money when necessary to be faster, essentially.
And were these like single camera television shows, or
Yeah, they shot like a feature film. I mean, they're always budgeted for 2 cameras. Some shows use 2 cameras all the time, but it was never the pressure to do that. In Big Love, we did tend to roll 2 cameras a lot because there were big scenes with family and kids, and so they embraced the kind of chaotic style. They kept the showrunners would use the word anti-formalist. We don't want the show to be formalist, and I trying to figure out what that meant. And I think it meant that they wanted a kind of looseness to the choreography, the camera work. They wanted to feel the chaos of this guy's life. So they wanted a little messiness in the frame. So 2 cameras kind of lent itself to that kind of thing. And
Were you also operating at that time?
no, I had, and I was second season. I inherited the crew from the first season. So it was all, Jim Glennen was the main DP on Big Love, and I came in the second season. But it was sad because I ended up shooting 2/3 of season 2 of Big Love because Jim Glennen turned out to had cancer. And when I came in, I got a call saying, "Can you come in and finish episode 1 for Jim? He's in the hospital." I go, "Okay." And I shot the last day of episode 1 for him. I started episode 2, and they said, "Can you shoot episode 3 because Jim's still in the hospital?" I said, "Okay." I didn't prep episode 3, but I'll shoot it. And I shot. And then they called me and said, "Can you do episode 4 because Jim's still in the hospital?" Wow. And I said, this isn't going to work. I'm not prepping any of these episodes. So Jim from the hospital asked Haskell Wexler to come in, and Haskell Wexler came in and shot episode 4 for him. And then on the last day of episode 4, which is the first day of episode 5, because the way they structured that show, the last day was an overlap with the first day. Jim Glennen passed away at the hospital we got the notice on set. So I did episode 5, and they said, "Can you do episode 6?" And I go, "Sure, okay, I'll do episode 6." And finally on episode 7, they found a replacement for Jim, which was Bill Wages. So Bill did episode 7 and 9, and I did 8 and 10. So I ended up doing 2/3 of that season.
Oh, wow.
So it was my first TV show. And I learned a lot, I was very meticulous about trying to match Jim Glennon's style, because I said, well, I'm the second DP. I'm following up with Jim. I got to match everything, make exactly like his approach to lenses and lighting. And then when Haskell Wexler came in to do his episode, he kind of just did what he wanted to do. He shot it a little more documentary style, more natural light, wide open on primes instead of the zoom that Jim used. But I went back to matching Jim's style on 5 and 6. Then Bill Wages came in and he lit it the way he likes to light, with bounce lighting and Licos and diffusion that Jim didn't use. And I started realizing that all the other DPs were doing what they thought was right, and I was sitting there trying to be someone else. I was trying to be Jim. And so after that, I just said, okay, clearly the things they're doing, I notice different because I'm a DP, but the producers, everyone else is not seeing the change because it's still within the style of the show.
When there are more than one DP like that, do they try to find, do they ever look to the first DP to find somebody that's close to their style so it does kind of match, or is it?
Well, when you do a TV show, your mantra is to follow the house style, the set of rules, visual style for the show. So it's your job to match them, but it's also your job or your goal to find ways to express yourself creatively. Mm-hmm. And so you look for those little holes where the matching isn't big of an issue. Maybe it's a location, it's a one-off location, for example, or maybe it's a dream sequence or flashback, which is out of the wheelhouse of the regular styles. So you start looking for opportunities to push yourself where you're allowed to push yourself. But otherwise, you try to still shoot the show that an average audience member isn't going to say, "Oh, that's a different style." But it happens on every show. A lot of, you have a show like Game of Thrones where they shoot mostly prime lenses, but then they get a big action episode and the DP will just use zooms on every camera and light to a 2.8 because he needs to get enough speed for the zooms, and and most audience members are not going to say, "Oh, they've switched from Cook
Yeah,
primes to ingenue zooms,"
Right.
you know. But a DP might catch that.
Do you think you have any sort of like signature kind of like shot that you try to always put in that you're like, that's what I do?
No, but you have an aesthetic that you can't ignore, you know, the sense of taste, basically. And I've tried to be a chameleon. I've tried to, in some ways, when I often do a project, I think of myself as another DP, you know,
Okay.
which is, I don't know why. I think because of my film school days or earlier, I learned by studying other people. So
Right.
I tend to think of myself as like, oh, this scene, I'm going to think of it like Jordan Cronenweth or Gordon Willis, or, you know, I'm not a strong individualist in that aspect. I like playing around too much with styles, but it was very useful in the Love Witch because it was meant to look like it was made in the 50s. So I tried to aesthetically approach it as if I was a 50s cinematographer and not try to put any modern sensibility into anything, you know. But for a television show, you still have your sense of taste, and I've had producers come to me and say things like, "You really have a knack for lighting women," and I'm like, "Okay, I've never thought of myself trying to do that, but I guess I do think I do lean in that direction, I guess, you know. I tend to see faces and see what looks good and not so good on them and try to and learn tricks to flatter them or not flatter them or whatever I need to do for the story. So there's that aspect. Because I love old 3-strip Technicolor films and Storaro's work in color, I tend to think in color themes, color symbolism. You know, is this day cool or warm, and how does that work story-wise and thematically, and how will that work with the flow of the story? I tend to break down a script in color. I like certain lighting effects, strong backlights from the sun. You know, I don't like backlights that are unmotivated, but when it's motivated, I like them very strong, like Parcan backlight, something haloing kind of the hair and things like that, or a hot slash on a bottom of a set or on a piece of furniture.
Yeah.
I like highlights, you know. And I think that's one aspect of a lot of modern cinematography has gotten away from is everything, not everything, but a lot of things tend to be dim and dark and moody, which I love too. But I also like highlights. So if I have a dark scene, I often have some tiny highlight in the frame because I tend to feel like if there's no highlight in the frame, things can go from looking dark to just looking murky or muddy.
Yeah, and it kind of like the highlight makes the dark look darker.
Yeah.
Sort of.
It's
I have a
something-
question
yeah.
for you about color. Specifically, you're talking about these like backlights and going through a scene in color. In Jennifer's Body, like that's like a really saturated, very punchy movie at times. Like how do you
Especially for horror.
Yeah, like
Yeah.
how do you keep that color and then still keep skin tones looking like supernatural? Is it like a combination of the production working with like wardrobe and the production designer, or is it like a certain stock or
It's partly, you know, the old Hollywood Technicolor style was that you could put color everywhere but on the faces. So they were very meticulous about flesh tone staying neutral even in a candlelit scene or a moonlit scene. I don't do that because that's not realistic necessarily, but I do think about it. So sometimes I will mix in a little bit of neutral color into my light on a face so the skin picks up still some of its redness in a blue scene and things like that. But you know, or if the color is in the background or on the backlight and not on the key light, things, that's a way to keep an eye on it. But so I do think about flesh tone. When do I deviate from it and when do I go back to it? Jennifer's Body, you know, I could have lit it like a traditional horror film, like all kind of grayish and black and whitish and bluish. But I tend to, when I break down a script, look at it like, is this a visual journey from an A to B story where it starts out one way and ends another way, or overall has a structure of a journey? Or is it a study in contrast? Is it the story of A versus B? You know, she's an uptown girl, he's a downtown guy, or, you know, he's from the country, or, you know, there's stories that are visual contrast stories where you have one world versus another, and you have stories that start out in one world and end in another world. And then you have stories that don't change at all. They're just one oppressive mood throughout, you know, and so you have to read the script and try to break down what sort of structure it's going. And a lot of horror films tend to follow this A to B structure where they start out in naturalism and they end up in expressionism. So the family moves into their dream house in the country, and it's a sunny day, and it's spring, and by the end of the movie, it's a lightning storm in an attic that's all rotting with dark wood, and it's just all gray and blue, and it looks like German expressionism, and that's the horror kind of classic horror lighting, because that's the structure of the story. It starts out, giving you the illusion everything is fine, and by the end, it's become this psychological world of horror and darkness. So Jennifer's Body sort of had that structure. It starts out almost like a high school comedy. It's in high school hallways and fluorescent lit rooms and houses, and so I knew visually it's going to have this high school horror comedy element. And do I want to make the high school look like a horror film, or do I want to embrace the kind of tropes of a high school movie? It's not. It starts out with a flash forward, or you get to the climax in the first few frames, and then it cuts back to the beginning of the story. So there's that, and also has this other structure where it's all being told by Needy when she's in this mental asylum. So there's that visual structure too. What's the visual structure of the mental asylum sequence? And so knowing I would be bookending it with this horror film elements and this prison element, which would be kind of desaturated, that I wanted to start the story timeline in high school with a warm look, so that I'd have somewhere to go from that look. So I played a lot of scenes this late afternoon in the classrooms and the houses and orange light, and then brought in cyans and blues as the horror element starts to get introduced. So by the ending, it always took place at the end in a swimming pool. Originally it was going to be an outdoor pool, but we're filming in spring and in Vancouver, and we could not imagine shooting all-nighters in water in a swimming pool. And if we heated the pool too much, it'd be steaming. So at some point we just had to say, we just can't do this in an outdoor swimming pool. It has to be an indoor swimming pool. So once it became an indoor swimming pool, it was great because not only we could shoot it in the daytime, but we made it this decrepit, abandoned swimming pool with rotting, half-filled water and weeds and moss and tree branches breaking through the windows. So it became this German expressionist kind of horror swimming pool, and I could light it with I had the mercury vapor pool lights come on. So I had this blue-green mercury vapor light. It was actually there on location. It was interesting because if you ever filmed in a high school gymnasium with the old school mercury vapor lights, one of the things you learn is they take like 5 to 10 minutes to come on, right? So if you ever lose power,
switch.
they're not going to come on again for 10 minutes. So the swimming pool lights, we wanted them to snap on, but I said in real life, they take 10 minutes to come on. So that shot, we just shot it in reverse. I said, I'm going to roll on the swimming pool lights and just pull the plug on them and they'll go out. And then we'll reverse it in post and have them pop on, so they would actually pop on. And then they were on for the rest of the sequence. And then I had them hang cool white fluorescents on broken fluorescents around the perimeter. And that's the whole look of that sequence was all cyan light and lights rippling off the water and things like that. So knowing we were ending up there, I played the early scenes opposite with a lot of golden sunlight through windows and things like that. But it was all shot sharp. We didn't do any diffusion. I mean, I've done that too, where I've started out with some sort of light diffusion and then pulled it as the film went on. I did this movie called Akeelah and the Bee. It was a spelling bee film. And it starts out with a young girl in South Central LA at a bad, middle school, unhappy, and she takes up spelling bees, and she ends up becoming a spelling bee champion. So to create some sort of visual arc for the film, one is I convinced the director to shoot it in anamorphic, because I said it was a $5 million film, but I said, everyone expects a kind of after-school special, indie film look. So I feel like when she gets to the National Spelling Bee in Washington, D.C., it should look like a Michael Bay film. It should look like a big experience and I actually dressed the stadium with dinos in the shot that were not lighting the shot. I put Indy 9 in front of them so I could hit the lens. Yeah. I wanted all these flares from the anamorphic lenses as if I said, it should feel like they're launching the space shuttle. It should just feel like this huge moment that she finally gets to compete nationally. I never told the producers of the Dinos were just set dressing, basically, because they weren't, lighting the scene. They were just creating the lens flares. So knowing, again, we're going to that ending, I said, well, the early scene should be as plain as possible. So we shot on film. I shot most of the film on vision stocks, but the early scenes I shot on Expression. Expression was a low contrast desaturated stock that Kodak made to compete with AGFA. When AGFA had a success with their XT320 film out of Africa, and it had a kind of pastel quality to it, Kodak came out with a stock called 5277, I think, which was their copy of AGFA, and then AGFA went out of business right after that, unrelated. They stopped selling motion picture negative in, I think, 1993 or 4 because EU laws had changed the processing that was allowed to process film, the chemicals, and AGFA looked at how much money they were making selling color negative film for movies and realized it wasn't worth spending the money to retool their factory to meet the new EU laws, so they just killed their motion picture line.
Wow.
Right when Kodak was putting out a stock to compete with AGFA. So they put out the 77 stock, and then they put out a updated version. That was a 320T low-con film. They then put out a 400-speed T film called Expression. I think it was 5287 or something like that. So I shot the first third of the movie with the Expression stock. Is also what we used on Big Love season 2 was Expression. It has this pastel quality, and I pulled the 85 filter so everything would be kind of cold and grayish. And then as she starts to travel to other schools and see how nice the other schools were and study spelling at practice after school, I switched to vision stock, and I went from no filters on the low-con film to light glimmer glass on the normal visions film. So there was some diffusion and warmth, and I started lighting scenes with tungsten light through windows for golden sunlight effects. And so as the film progresses, it gets warmer and warmer and a little more diffused and prettier, essentially. And then you get to the final spelling bee, and it's a very glamorous, kind of high-key look with all the lights flaring the lens and stuff. So that's, again, how I structure a film. I see it as a visual journey, and that's sort of based on studying Vittorio Storaro, because he writes these page-long essays of what the visual structure of the film will be, whether it's Dick Tracy or Last Emperor, and he finds a visual story that he can tell through light and color that matches the script story. And I still tend to break down scripts like that.
When you're doing that kind of transition, whether it's filters or lenses or lights or anything like that, are you also talking to the production designer to see if they're matching that quality with like the things that they're putting in, or is it you making the changes will affect their set enough?
It all depends on how early I'm brought in, but I definitely, of course, have to work with the production designer, and I will talk about my ideas, and I hear what their ideas are, and if they're very different, we have to then discuss whether we collaborate or compromise, or I just accept that, his vision is going to be the look of the show. Especially with television, we shoot so many sets, so many locations, and so many episodes. I remember on Maisel, we'd go from, nightclub to nightclub, or bar locations for his stand-up acts. And a lot of them I lit, one episode I decided to go black and red, like Lenny Bruce does a number and it's edgy, and I'm going to do red par cans and he's in black, and so I'm going to go with this black and red look. Later on in the next episode, we had another club scene, and I was saying, I just want to get away from the red tones. I think I'm going to do a nightclub all in blues and neon blues and stuff, like a blues club jazz thing. But then the location they found finally was red leather seats, wooden walls, red brick. And I said, I've learned a long time ago is you can't fight a location, because this happened to me on a short film. I wanted a cold look for an office sequence, and they picked a location that was all wooden floors and red brick walls. And I tried lighting with blue light through the windows, and all I got was blue faces. The walls still stayed red, the floor still stayed brown, but the faces went blue from the blue lighting. So you just can't a room wants to be a certain way, and you have to look at it and say either I embrace it or I need a lot of art direction or something to change it. But places tend to tell you how they want to be shot, and so when I saw this place, I said I don't want to fight it with me, so I'm going to embrace the warmth of this location. So then to save that idea for a blue nightclub for later. So yeah, I have to work with the production designer, and that's sort of why early on when I talk to director about what I'm thinking about a film, sometimes you get this pushback is that that's too extreme. You can't do the whole movie in orange and then go to green and then go to blue, and it's going to look very cartoonish. And I go, it seems very simplistic, but the truth is the reality of making a film, all your ideas get watered down. Like you say, I'm going to do this whole scene in blue, but you get to the location, it's got brown bookshelves and it's got a brick wall out the window. And you go, well, your blue has now been muted. I said almost everything, you have to start out with very simple, strong concepts, because the reality of filmmaking is all those ideas are going to get watered down to a natural looking level. That's subtle, it's just good. It gets subtle. It gets more subtle and more realistic by the realities of making the film. And so but you have to start out with a very simple idea in order to end up with something where, the reality gets filtered. The funny story is about Dick Tracy, because in Dick Tracy, Storaro had a very definite color scheme idea that was opposite the production designer's color scheme. Right? And so Warren Beatty described it as a vegetable soup, where Storaro is doing this and Richard Silvert's doing this, and what you end up with is sort of their mix, basically. Storaro, because Dick Tracy was established in the comic books as wearing yellow, he decided, well, if Dick Tracy is yellow, he represents the sun. So everyone around his orbit would be in that color range, orange, red, yellow. And so all the villains have to be the opposite. They have to be purples and blues and blacks. But Richard Silbert said that Big Boy Caprice is like Adolf Hitler. So all the bad guys will be the colors of the Nazi flag, red and black.
Wow.
But Storaro has saved red and oranges for the good guys and purple. So he's now trying to light Big Boy Caprices with purple and blue, but you got to set there. Everyone's wearing red suits, and it's interesting mix of two ideas and creating a third idea, essentially.
So when you're going on location scouts, you're looking at these potential locations, the location, the practicals that are maybe in the location, that sort of is defining what that look of that room will be for you. So you're kind of like, instead of coming in and just making it whatever you want, you're working with the natural.
You look at a location and you think about what can I change and what can't I change, and what can I change easily and what can I change with great difficulty. An industrial space like this has got fluorescent lights, which are actually probably LED tubes, but daylight. They can be switchable from daylight to tungsten. So you, right off the bat, you go like, well, I could have a tungsten lit interior, a 3200K interior with a daylight mix, or I could just be straight daylight, or I could turn everything off inside and just have daylight. And does the daylight have to be daylight? It could be, I could use tungsten lights for a sunsetty look, Often in real life, interiors with artificial lights tend to be warmer than the exteriors, daylight, because daylight is in that 5600 range. But you can flip that on its head. You could have orange daylight and bluish interior lighting if you establish fluorescence. It's not, in reality, you don't tend to get that extreme, because cool white fluorescents are like 4800 Kelvin. So they're still not full daylight. But if you, in your brain, you say, what I love is a deep cyan interior with orange light coming through the windows, that's getting into the realm of something that doesn't naturally happen in real life. But people accept it. Okay, sunlight is orange and the fluorescents are cyan. That they see those two elements separately in real life. So they'll accept that when you put them together. When technically in real life, you don't have that extreme color difference change. But so you look at a location, and you imagine what you can and can't do, and what you talk to the art department. What are you planning with practicals, especially if it's a bar or a nightclub, and that's where your discussion can be, do I want little table lamps? Do I want red neon? Do I want to do fake red neon with LED tubes behind bottles? Where can I put in color, and should I put in color? These are all things you imagine, I take pictures of locations and I go home and look at them and I try to imagine them. And often when you're scouting, I'll just turn off and on everything. Like just turn off all the overheads, turn them all on, just turn those on, turn those off, and see how it changes the look of the room. Especially night exteriors where you can do so much at night, especially in a city environment. I'll go back 2 or 3 times with my camera and see how I'll sit there and imagine, well, the street's light were these colors and the store windows are those colors. And, can I mix them? Can I change them? You push things around. I just did a night exterior on Houston Street, and most of the New York street lights there are kind of they're kind of a weird halfway tungsten daylight color. They're like 4500 with a little bit of green in them.
Yeah,
They're like those new LED, whatever. Yeah.
So they're not really bluish daylight, but they're not warm tungsten, and it's definitely not sodium. So they're cooler than the tungsten lights on the townhouses and those light bulbs, but they're warmer than the fluorescents that are in other stores. So you look at that reality and you start to think, well, if I replace the street lights on this block with S60s, I can make them any color I want. But then the next block in the shot is still LED colored, whatever that is. Do I match it? Do I let this block be one color and the next block be another color? And
I guess that all depends on like time, manpower, and like what.
Yeah.
And then what the
and
story
then also the
needs.
mood. It's a romantic story sequence. Maybe they walk from a cool white fluorescent-y area to a warm tungsten-y area, and they get into warm lighting and things like that. One of the hardest things I had was this sequence in Marvelous Mrs. Maisel, which was a big traffic jam sequence. It was on Central Park West by the New York Historical Society and the Natural History Museum, and it's all lit with street lamps, in real life. But because we're doing a 360-degree camera move, I'm worried about camera shadows from the real street lights. Mm-hmm. But if I shut them down, then Central Park, which is not really well lit, is only lit with what spill is coming from those street lamps. So if I shut them down, then the trees in Central Park will go dark. But I need to control the street lamps to avoid camera shadows. So I had this idea: in front of every street lamp, I would hang an S30 right in front of the bulb. So the S30 would act like a flag. So the real street lamp would stay on, and it would light the trees in Central Park. It would light the sidewalk, but the street itself would actually be lit by the S30 with the matching color. So now, as I'm 360 around, if I need to dim out a street lamp, I'll dim out the S30, and it acts like a solid to block the actual street lamp.
So you're actually like live mixing your lights, like with your board up.
Right.
Wow.
So I could say when I'm coming around this way, kill the S30s, and then I won't get a camera shadow anymore from those street lamps.
Double duty.
And then come around.
So the idea of using it as a flag is awesome.
But that took some thinking. Like I kept thinking, like, do I leave them on? Do I replace them? I leave them on, replace them. And I had this idea of simultaneously using them. And, ideally I would replace them and lit Central Park separately, but I just couldn't afford to do that. So
can you talk a little bit about, like, I'm assuming you scouted that during the day.
Yeah, but I went back on my own 2 or 3 times just at night.
Is that normal? Is that like really
normal
the ideal
for me? I mean,
I'm just curious. It's like how often.
We've already talked about this with the color room.
How often do you actually get to scout like a location when you're going to shoot it? Because it seemed like nightclubs, a lot of them don't have windows in that show, but like they take place at night. It's a lot of night stuff. But
with the interiors, you can imagine if I can go back at night to see them. If it's a restaurant, sometimes I'll just go get a meal there at night and sit there and look around, on my own time. But if you have to scout a place at night, you'll ask the location person, can you book me a separate trip here at night? Or, right now we've got a nighttime rooftop sequence for the show I'm doing. And I asked them that we scout it at night. I said, there's no reason to go on a rooftop in the daytime and look at New York City in the daylight when it's a night scene. I have to know if there's a ridiculously bright billboard there, or if there's a
giant LED panel.
Or a pitch black building. I have to know that right away, and I don't want to scout it with a director and then go back at night and then tell them, all those angles we picked don't work at night, because so we're actually scouting at night for those things. But usually you scout in the daytime, so you have to, if I have to return back at night, I will, which is, fine. It's a lot easier with digital because you probably have enough light with most digital cameras that you could embrace most of the natural light and just augment it yourself. The one location I just recently shot in Houston, the problem I had was sort of the opposite. I had a big marquee that was a certain brightness that was pretty bright, and it would be impossible to ND gel it. I don't even know how I would get into it and get into the guts of it and gel it. So I had to think about lighting the street because I had to balance the street for that one big sign, so that's was sort of the opposite problem. If I didn't have that one sign, I could have done it with half the light level, and but
you're just working with the elements that are there.
Yeah.
Right. That happens. Times Square is the only time I've ever shot with an ND filter at night. I went there for a sequence for Smash 10 years ago, and in Duffy Square there, 360 Steadicam shot, and I was at a 5.6, and I was like, I don't want to shoot the scene at 5.6. I ended up putting in 6 or something in there to get down to a 2.8, just because those jumbotrons and everything. It was just a ridiculous amount of light there. So,
is there a location that you remember in all of your career that was just like, I don't know, it just keeps you up at night? It's the trauma of fighting it, because I know we all have locations we worked on. It's like never again. Like,
Oh yeah, I have a name for a location.
yeah, I remember
246. I got royally screwed in the location.
yeah, I've forgotten most of the horror ones. I think
I just put it out of your brain.
But things that were too high in the air or too, it's like the worst case scenario is the sun hits the white building right out the window and you can't do anything about it. Locations that fire alarms, smoke detectors gone off, fire department has shown up, all sorts of, or it's next to a train that you didn't it's like not so much my problem with the sound guys screaming because there's a train going by every 5 minutes out the window, or
because the sound guy doesn't come to the tech scout. Does he?
they should. I think they should, but they're not often available. But so I sometimes do try to think about it. The sound, oh, this is great, but this fountain, we got to control it because the sound guy's going to want to shut it off every time it's off camera, or you try to help them out when you can, because it's going to be an issue.
How many of those considerations do you also make for like actors, even just for blocking? Do you also think of about them?
Yeah, of course. I try to. I remember earlier in my career when I started doing television, we were in doing these domestic dramas in living rooms, and the grip department would constantly say, "Why don't we just clear out the furniture? Everything behind camera, just clear it out." And I go, "Well, it's all got to come back the moment we turn around." And second is, if we completely empty out the room to only what's on camera, the actors are going to be working in this surreal environment. I know it's surreal enough for them with lighting and cameras, but I still feel like we should maintain something of the room if it's not in the way, because it'd be faster when we turn around if we don't bring back couches. But also, it just feels like the environment and not like a set anymore. So I try to think of, off-camera actors. Where are they going to stand? If actors have to leave the frame or enter the frame, do they have a path? What are their eye lines? Off-camera eye lines are going to be, you try to keep all that in mind, because it'll come up on the moment. Like the actors, I can't leave. There's a C-stand right there when I have to, or my eye line's blocked by this and that or whatever. And sometimes, you can't help it. Like you want to give them a big soft key light, so you put an 8x in front of a Light Mat 8 or something. So it's completely blocking 2/3 of their view of the room now. And it's like a scene where they're looking out at a crowd. You go like, I'm sorry, but I'm going to put a red piece of tape on the middle of this 8x. That's your eye line too, because it's either that or not have this nice key light, But you do think about that. Sometimes you think like, well, I'll pull back part of the silk and tie it back so there's a gap that you can see through to something, or raise it higher so you can see under it, or things like that, just so that there's something for them to look at. But
Yeah. And even like on a show like Mrs. Maisel, like there are these very complicated like camera movements and stuff. Like how much of like is it all decided around the blocking, or is it the other way around? Like how does the camera movement get decided?
Yeah, it's based on blocking rehearsal. When Amy Sherman Palladino lays out a complicated shot, and she's very good at choreography of actors to camera, but she doesn't think about where the furniture is and how close or far the camera has to be, because the tricky thing is that she likes to circle actors, but she doesn't want to be close. She doesn't like close-ups. So our close-ups on the show are like navel up, that's a close-up, or waist up, tightest chest up. But so when we're blocking and her hand is the camera and she goes, we're here. But she's always like 2 feet from the actors. And I go, well, with a 24 mil waist up, we've got to be 5 feet from the actors. So do this, but do it from 5 feet away. But it never works out that way. So I have to start thinking like, okay, this wall's in the way. Maybe the actor, I'd say something like, we can get this moment, but I need the actor standing there instead of here. And this chair is going to have to be out of the way. I talked to Jim McConkey a lot. We'd talk through. It's like, you think you're going to cross in front of the chair or behind the chair? Because it's roughly where your path is. And do we need to fly it in and out, slide it in the frame? And do you have time? Do we have time when we spin around for someone to slide it back into the shot? Or is it just going to be missing? Or, there's a lot of furniture moving and considerations. And then there's also the lighting problems. Often that's just my problem to figure out how I'm going to light after we've choreographed it and figure out the move. Then I have to sit, they turn to me and I say, well, I'll figure it out, and often it means lighting from the ceiling or hand-holding lights. I'll say, okay, I need someone hand-holding a light mat 4 behind in the hallway, and when the camera comes this way and passes, you step out and key them, and then it comes back around this way, you got to hide again, and
I do that all the time.
Yeah, you're a master at that.
yeah, it's a lot of hand-holding.
It's like almost
lights.
choreography behind the camera as you film this choreography.
Yeah, I was going to ask about that because it seems like a lot of TV shows. I mean, it seems like the standard is like 8 to 10 days of filming, but like Mrs. Maisel has like at least one huge oneer in almost every single episode. So do you guys is there an extra day dedicated to a shot like that or anything?
If it depends. If it's a scene in like their Midge's apartment, generally that's just done in the blocking rehearsal, and we'll just light it. It's a oneer, but we don't cover the oneer. So it's like, even if it takes 4 hours to do a oneer, it's going to cover 8 pages, and you're still on schedule by the time you're done. So,
but like the camp, there's like dance routines. And,
but when it gets really complicated, we will schedule a rehearsal, pre-rehearsal, pre-blocking. And if it's a really complicated camera move, we'll even schedule a camera rehearsal day. Mm-hmm. Maybe it might be after wrap, or it might be at the end of a day. And if it's still not working, we might schedule a second camera rehearsal. We say, well, now that we've seen this rehearsal, this is the problems. We need art department to saw away the railing here, and we need to build a platform here, and we need to do this instead of that. And we can't be assured that it's going to work on the day. So now we need a second camera rehearsal day to see if our new approach is going to work. That doesn't happen often, like once or twice a season. We might get a shot that complicated.
Is there a process for fighting for that? Like, is it because the show was doing so well, you had the affordability to be able to fight? Or
that's mainly, Amy will see what the shot is going to be based on the blocking, and then she'll say, I think we should have a rehearsal day or camera rehearsal. I don't want to try to do this on the day of and have it not work. So we'll schedule camera rehearsal day for it. And that happened with this scene in the last episode, where Susie goes up from the ground floor to the second floor of the Mike scene. First of all, she referenced the Graduate. She goes, I want to do the Graduate moment where he's yelling, Elaine, Elaine. And so I played back that scene, and I realized I always imagined it a big zoom in on Dustin Hoffman, but it was actually a zoom in of his POV on Elaine from the second floor. So I said, well, in that sequence, it's a zoom in on the POV. It's so Susie's POV looking up at Mike, a big crash zoom, is our Graduate moment. And then she comes into the room, and then Amy said, how do we get her from the first floor to the second floor? Because I do want to do it in one. And I said, well, the problem is if we try to do it on Steadicam, we'd have to walk backwards up a staircase, which is always difficult. It's also a lot of shoe leather. But I said, what if we just meet her at the top, the second floor? She goes up the stairs and we lose her, and we reacquire her on the top of the landing with the camera. But then the question is, are we Steadicamming on the second floor? Do we take a Steadicam platform on a crane and lift Jim to the second floor and remove the railing so he can step off and then Steadicam around? But then she comes out the second door and she goes down another set of stairs. And then it's like, well, then we Steadicam backwards. And they're walking so fast, it's near impossible to keep up with them with a Steadicam on the staircase. So I said, well, it should be a techno crane move to the second floor. But because the big chunk of that, the railing the narrow is so tight, I think we could just stay on the crane and just track with them from midair. So as they walk along the hallway, we'll parallel them on the crane, stay on the techno crane. But then when they get to the next turn, we have to get off the crane and start to back because we're going to go through a doorway. So it has to be a Movi disconnect. So we'll techno crane up, go over a rail, disconnect, walk backwards on the Movi, go through 2 doors, end up on the staircase, at which point we have to connect to a second techno crane to then take them down that staircase quickly.
It's crazy.
So we got to reconnect to a second techno crane and get them to the base of the stairs, and without seeing the platform, because we're backing onto a landing of the staircase. It's not big enough for the actors, the Movi operator, to connect to a crane. So I have to have art department now double the size of the landing of the staircase. And we did it all in black so that you don't see it, essentially, painted black. And so we back onto the second landing. The actors step onto the first landing. We connect to the techno crane, and we then go downstairs to the base of the stairs. So we first did a blocking rehearsal. Then we scheduled a rehearsal with the crane, and we got it 80% there. It's very difficult to do the connects and disconnects for that sequence. And one of the first thing I said was, if we crane up from the first floor to the second floor, I would love it if we could remove the rail and have visual effects put it back in, because if we don't, we got to we got to rise up and get higher than the railing and then get over it. So the camera move is going to be kind of an L-shaped hop. And it's a lot more elegant if it's a diagonal move, but then we're crossing through a gap in the rail. So it's got to look like we magically threaded the needle and went through 2 bars of the railing. And so it's got to be a visual effects thing. So I had to mark on the wall where the rails were and remove them so that so the grips could aim the camera. So I said, I don't want to end up in post having the camera magically go through a rail. It has to actually go through the gap that doesn't exist. So we marked the wall where all the rail spots were. But then we come off the other side, we go over the top of the rail, and our B operator, Nick Nas, has to grab the camera and disconnect it. So it's underslung, so the camera's coming over the top of the rail, but the magnet and the handles are above that, so she's got to reach above the camera to grab it, and then they disconnect the magnet and then take the weight of it and walk backwards quickly with the actors. So we got it about 80% there. And then Amy saw that, and she goes, okay, the next scene after that is the scene where they all go into the studio, and it's the start of the show where the writers are there, Midge is there, parents arrive, everyone arrives. She goes, I would love it if we don't cut and we just keep going. We get to the base of the stairs and then go into the next scene all as a oneer in the studio in a Steadicam move or Movi move. And I said, well, okay, except that our one Movi operator is stuck on the second floor of the office. She can't get down to this first floor because she's just let go of the camera on the second floor. So we need a second Movi operator because Jim McConkey is operating on the wheels for everything. So we had to bring in Jeff Mulstock. And Jeff Mulstock, who was my steady operator on Smash 10 years ago, he came in to take over the Movi the second time. So we disconnect from the second techno crane. He now walks backwards with the actors into the studio, and we do another 1 minute oneer in the studio. So it becomes an overall 3 minutes, uncut shot, basically.
Wow.
With,
3 camera operators.
yeah, two movie operators and
2
Jim.
techno cranes.
2 techno cranes. Yeah, it's always the question of, where do we put Jim McConkey? Because he's in one spot for 3 rooms, and he's operating by monitor. But yeah, that was interesting.
Can you talk about some of those special rigs? Like you said, it's an magnetic disconnect, but
Yeah.
like then how do you balance the techno crane when it loses that weight? Like what were the kind of things you guys had to deal with when you came up with this?
Yeah, well, that's the problem with the magnet releases. It has to also have a safety chain just for safety reasons. So simultaneously we're disconnecting the camera from the magnet. We're also disconnecting a cable, which is the trickiest timing to do. And I think with the weight shift, it's not enough of a change that the grip can't handle the sudden release of the camera. It's not like a 200-pound person stepping off. It's just 30 pounds being disconnected, so the camera will rise up immediately. But our dolly grip, Jake Fontaine, handles that. So that's how we deal with the connecting. It's just there's always a little pause the moment you connect or disconnect, and it's always tricky to hide that pause because you want it to feel continuous. So we try to build in something that happens in the scene that allows the camera to slow down for a beat. But when we try not to actually stop completely to connect if we can't help it. So it can take a number of takes. The connection disconnection is often why we have to go again, because that's just the timing of that hiccup. And if there is a shift too. The camera tends to bounce when it gets connected or disconnected with the magnet. So you're trying to minimize that too, so you don't see a sudden drop. It's tricky. This takes skill and time. I have a sort of core team that pulls off these shots, and to do it, I need all of them. Which is one of them is my key grip, Charlie Sharon, who has to work out which cranes and devices we might use for these shots, along with talking to Jim McConkey and his brother Larry McConkey on the camera side. I've got Anthony Capello, who's my focus puller, and an amazing focus puller, does these shots all day long. Brandon Babbitt is our second AC, and he's trained himself on the Movi, so it's up and running quickly all the time, which is great. And then Jake Fontaine is our dolly grip, and so he's often doing the complicated jib arm moves and techno crane moves. So it's really those people that are able to pull off these shots.
For sure.
Charlie, Jake, Jim, Larry, Anthony, Brandon. So couldn't do it without them.
While we're on the topic of these rigs that you have on the show, I'm curious about, I know there's a specific rig that you had on Mrs. Maisel, which is been coined the name the McConkey Wonder Stick, and I'd be curious to hear where that name came from and what this rig is that you used on the show.
The Wonder Stick came about on beginning of, I think it's season 2, when Midge goes to work at B. Altman. She ends up in this switchboard room, and Amy wanted a oneer where we start out. It's a tour in a sense that it starts out on the ground floor of B. Altman's department store, and goes down an aisle and ends up going through a letter slot. Follows a piece of mail down the slot and out the basement, and we reveal Midge is working in the basement in the switchboard room. She's been demoted from makeup counter to the switchboard room. So obviously, I always knew that this first floor and the second floor would be connected to some visual effects. So we steady cammed up on the first floor. We ended up pushing in on a letterbox. The visual effects continued it into a CGI shot, following the letter down the slot and onto a basket. And we follow then the mailman down the hall, and then he leads us towards the switchboard room. At that point, we fly through the switchboard room, past all the switchboard operators, find Midge, and she gets pushed around from station to station on her rolling chair as she solves everyone's problems at their switchboard. Amy was worried. She says, I want the camera to keep up with Midge. When she kicks off in the rolling chair, the camera has to fly back with her, and she was worried that the camera would not move fast enough. There was originally some talk about trying to do some sort of a cable cam, sky cam rig, but I realized that wasn't going to work because we'd have to saw off all the ceilings to all the sets in order to fly the camera around, and then digitally replace them all. But all the lighting is coming from the ceiling too. Right. But I also didn't think that was going to solve the problem. And so once they built the switchboard room set, which 2 rows of real switchboards from a museum we found, I looked at the distances and I realized it's not that big a space. So Jim felt that just by extending his arm with the camera and sucking in quickly, he or whoever's going to operate the camera could keep up with a rolling chair, no matter how fast it got pushed, because it's only traveling like 4 feet before it hits the next row. So although it was still an issue of like whether we chasing or pulling, because if we're chasing, it's easier. She kicks off and we chase after her. If we're behind her and she kicks off at us, we got to not get hit by her. Yeah. We have to pull back quickly, and that's always the problem with those sort of motions. So the other issue was I looked at the historical footage of switchboard operators, and I noticed some of them, they had little desk lamps, because the room had fluorescent lights in the center between the 2 rows of switchboards, but every operator is facing the switchboard, so their backs are to the overhead. So it's like shooting actors all facing a wall that's like 2 feet in front of their face. So I said, what's going to light their face, actually? So I noticed in the historical photos that switchboard operators sometimes had a little tiny desk lamp because they had to write notes and memos and take notes. So I asked the art department, is there anything you can give me for the operators to light their faces? And they ended up installing a bare light bulb along the wall in front of every switchboard operator. So I had this little 25-watt bulb, I think, or 15-watt bulb in a row for on each side, lighting their faces. So I went for a cyan fluorescent and then a warm tungsten glow from these light bulbs on their faces, because I still wanted it to feel like an underground space. So I wanted this sort of cool white fluorescent-y feeling to compare it to the upstairs. So we get down there, and then the next issue was I looked at the choreography, and I thought, well, the easiest thing would be to track along the backs of the heads of the operators. But the more interesting thing would be somehow to track in front of their faces between the switches and their face, which is their hands are in the air unplugging and plugging in wires. And I thought if I could somehow thread that needle between their noses and the wall with the camera, it's going to be more interesting than to travel along the backs of their heads to midge. So then the question was how to get the camera to get in that gap and whether we could do it with the Alexa. And Jim and Larry came up with, essentially was a short boom pole with a counterweight, with the Movi dangling on one end and a counterweight at the other end. And they would hold it using an Armorman rig to take some of the weight off. And Larry McConkey would operate the camera physically, and Jim McConkey would operate the wheels on the Movi. And so we ran down the room. Larry started out high on an apple box so we could do the effect of the camera dropping from the letterbox onto the basket of letters. So he started high, tipped down, and he stepped off an apple box and then chased the letter carrier down the hall and then went into the switchboard room and then started holding the boom pole with the camera dangling over the noses of the switchboard operators, who still had to lean out of the way of the camera. So luckily, at some point in our show, Amy decided that she really needed dancers to play extras, because we do so many complicated moves where actors have to just get out of the way or hit a mark in timing with the camera, and she knew dancers could do it. So half our extras in a lot of these scenes are dancers, and so we had dancers mixed in with our actors in the switchboard room, and so they would lean in and out as the camera passed their noses. Anthony Capello had a hard focus pull because we're tracking down a bunch of faces. Normally we don't do close-ups, but we're going very close to a bunch of faces, and he's trying to time the focus on each face coming into frame. So we go past the one face and we have to roll to the next face and then pull with that face for a few frames before we roll to the next face and then pull forward again and back and forth, back and forth. And I was worried about camera shadows from the light bulbs, but luckily I didn't see any, basically. The other issue is the hands on the switches pulling the cables, like will they hit the camera, will they block? And that's where the dancers really helped time that. So we land on midge, and then we basically were trying to figure out whether we should back up with her or get past her, circle her, and chase her with the camera. And we ended up deciding it was better to circle her. So the camera gets to her midge and circles around her till we end up 180 degrees. And then she kicks off on her chair and we chase her with the camera to the next woman. Then we 180 again around her and then chase her to the next position till the shot's over with this Wonder Stick rig. So that was the first time we used the Wonder Stick. And since then, Larry has made it more, improved it and made it a little more elaborate where he can do a longer pull. So it's sort of almost like a Trinity rig. He can have a longer boom pull with a bigger counterweight, and now it's mounted to a Steadicam arm instead of an Armorman system. So he's got it dangling on a Steadicam arm. He can raise and lower it as a pull with a counterweight, essentially.
Wow. It's like an old boom pole, like how
Yeah.
they used to have those massive boom poles back in
The Fisher jib.
Yeah, but this is more like a boom pole that a boom operator would use, or it's a black piece of pipe with a weight on one end and the camera at the other end. So it's heavy.
Yeah,
That kind of rig is why you were taking into account like the weight of your lenses and stuff like that's.
Yeah, anything I could do to shave the weight off the camera, and we have Larry bought I think it's a Sony FX6. So we have the option of an even lighter camera if we want to or need to. It's just less weight to fling around. We've only used it once so far with the FX6 on it. Otherwise we've used the Alexa 35. So it's also, we did a complicated shot in a taxi cab traffic jam sequence in the end of season 5 of Maisel where we used I think it's a DJI Ronin's tiny, I forgot the name of it. It's, you hand hold it and it's got a little
stick gimbal.
Yeah,
Is it the RS
You have like the Pocket 3.
No, it was I forgot the name of it, but we used that because we needed to hand the camera through a taxi cab window and grab it the other side and hand it out again. So we did it with this DJI.
It's like the RS2 or RS3, I think.
Yeah,
like
I think
little guy.
Yeah, this was a full frame sensor camera though on it. I think it was like an FX6 type camera in their camera. We did a DJI drone handoff shot in season 5 where we flew a drone onto a boat in the harbor at night in New York and then grabbed it in midair and then walked it to a party sequence.
Wow.
And that was a little Micro Four Thirds sensor.
You grabbed
camera.
the drone?
Yeah.
So it wasn't like a magnetic handoff. You just physically
grabbed
the
air.
drone, turned the props off, and
that's.
walked
I'm
around
actually
the drone.
surprised that like a safety monitor would allow that.
Well, that we had the drone rules in New York are very restrictive. You can't fly a drone over land, so we had to launch it from a boat and onto a boat. It's not allowed to fly over people, so that's why the moment it got to the boat, it had to be switched off and then handheld through the people in the party. So it never flew over people.
Man, that must have been really funny, just seeing someone carry a drone.
Well, the other problem is we're flying right at the boat, so we're flying right at the drone operator who's going to catch it.
So he's got to hide somewhere.
Well, he had to wear a tuxedo.
Yeah, I was gonna ask. Yeah,
He's standing on the prow of the boat.
Yeah.
The camera flies past him, and then he steps in and grabs it. But he's dressed in a tuxedo
that's
and like he's a party goer.
They got a SAG card that day.
Yeah.
It's amazing. Speaking of all this like modern tech drones and stuff like that, is there any like new tools that you've encountered that you're finding yourself using over and over again on these sets?
Well, a lot of Maisel's been shot with light mats as our key light, so light mat 8s and 4s and 2s and 2Ls. We use bicolor light mats. We've had them for years, but when we got to Paris on our new show, in Paris they all had the RGB light mats,
the spectrums.
The spectrums. So that's been interesting. It's sort of a love-hate thing because the nice thing about bicolor lights is you just pick a color temperature. Mm-hmm. With a spectrum, you like, get me, 4,300, and he comes up and goes, it looks a little green. Go, okay, we'll mix a little magenta in it. It's too magenta. Take a little magenta. So I find myself eyeballing the color a lot to get it to something that, and it's fine, but I get uncomfortable doing that, like constantly just creating a color that looks right to my eye and then going for it. I feel like it's an imprecise way of working, but it is also very flexible. With the bicolor lights, sometimes I have to add gel, some green or magenta. Mostly add some green to them because they run a little magenta. But with the spectrums, I find myself dialing in green or magenta all the time, but by eye, and it's a little bit, I never know exactly, with a bunch of lights, how much green or magenta I'm playing around with. But
you have like so many options.
Yeah,
now.
it's
Now
almost
you can
too much, but it's very flexible. I've always used Lecos a lot, the Source 4 Lecos and the tungsten ones. We're trying to use more of the LED ones, the lusters now. The color has gotten better. I still occasionally would rather use the tungsten ones because I know exactly what color I'm going to get out of that. And also the 750 watt tungsten Leco is brighter than the luster.
Yeah.
So.
The lenses on the Luster 3 are so huge too. It's like not a nice compact light anymore.
Yeah. And also, like if I want bright daylight, I use Joe Leco still a lot, so Joker 800 in a Leco is quite bright, and it'll balance with a day interior pretty well. And I like Lecos because I can cut them and they don't need much flagging or anything like that. Or I use them as a hard slash or some things. So I still use certain types of lights I fall back on, like Parkans, tungsten Parkans, 9 lights and 12 lights. There's nothing really in the LED world the same as a Maxi Brute, or a 20K or a mole beam, a 10K mole beam, or all those sort of hot, spotty, strong lights. I still haven't found a good LED version of yet. So this is a hybrid kind of package. We've been using as an eye light on the Steadicam a lot. Is just we have a NYX bulb from Astera and it's DMXable, so it's run by the dimmer board operator, which is great because if I'm Steadicamming around with this eye light and I pass a mirror or a glass window, I can fade it out before we catch its reflection and then fade it up again or bring it up and down as I get closer to an actor. And in our electric department, someone built using a
like a
CNC kind of thing, a housing for it. So it's like a little square housing and it fits onto our camera and stuff like that.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, so it's...
You just plug that into a D-tap?
Yeah.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah. So that's been very useful. Otherwise, we use Light Mat ones handheld, or lately the Aladdin, which I'm not sure who makes the Aladdin, but it's a smaller 1x1.
So you're using a board op for a lot of these jobs because you're constantly,
Making
dimming
cues,
off, dimming on. Yeah. Making cues. So how is that something that you had earlier in your career in like these older movies, or has that been something that you've seen?
It's crept in, it's more and more becoming the norm. And when I started doing studio stage work on television, the most of the lighting went through a board, and that's where I started getting used to cueing things to the board. But it was still most sets were tungsten lit, and it's been a transition. It's been hard because LEDs are more efficient energy-wise, but more expensive to rent. So it's been very hard to get producers, when you say, well, I know we had tungsten space lights for out the windows, but now I want to switch to LED space lights, and they cost more, but I have more flexibility for color and intensity and dimming them, and they use less power, but often the power isn't always a budgeted item. The power is something the stage eats the cost of. In the early days, at least. Now I think stage rentals they're charging for their power. So, but before the producers come to me and say, well, I don't care about saving electricity. I'm not paying for the electricity part. So,
the gels.
There's heat issues. LEDs are cooler and don't make the set as hot. But I've gradually switched from lighting backings with sky pans to sky panels, let's say, and that's just a lot less heat, a lot less power, but also a lot more money to rent. So it's a budgetary issue. I think LED is clearly the future. It's just tungsten is so much cheaper to rent.
But there'll probably always be some home for tungsten. Like it's not like one is going to take over the other one's job. It's just a new tool, right?
There's still nothing. I light the daylight windows with 20Ks or a 10K mole beam. Those are the two things that really create strong daylight on a stage set. And there's no LED version of a 20K yet. So, and
even like larger HMIs, like the throw that they have, like an LED can't really match something.
I like, in New York, I've been lighting streets at night, sometimes with sky panel 360s, but they're heavy. And if I need 2 or 3 on a Condor, that's maxing the weight out of a Condor. Can take two 360s on them, maybe 3 at the most. But when I did that boat sequence in New York Harbor, I thought about putting, we had a a barge, and I thought, well, I'll put some 360s on a Condor on the lighting barge, but I kept calculating distance in the harbor from my lighting barge to the yacht and the camera boat and all this stuff, and it kept coming into just foot candles. I just needed 2 Arri Max 18Ks is the only thing that would throw enough light at that distance to get me a 2.8 on the boat. So, or 2 even.
Yeah, because they're not only going to throw like 20 something feet.
So you had a
off.
Condor on a barge?
Yeah, we had a light.
It's literally a boat with lights.
That's horrifying for that operator.
Well, I didn't have a person.
Okay.
I didn't have a person up in it.
I was going to say, I like lift work. I'm not sure if I would take that one.
Yeah,
I didn't even know that was a thing.
yeah.
Was that your first time doing a lighting barge, or have you done that before?
I think it might have been the first. I maybe have had one before, but that's the first major lighting barge. I remember on Westworld, David Franco had a huge lighting barge to do a moonlight on the harbor in Santa Monica Harbor at Point Doom. At the end of the season 2, there's the moon's rising over the ocean. So he had like I don't know what it was, like a huge light on a lighting barge. And it was interesting. The intensity was right, but at that distance on the horizon, it's literally like 3 inches above the frame line. Like, I don't care if it's a 200-foot crane. It's still, when you look at it, it's literally right in your eye line. It's not above the frame line at all. So in post, they turned it into a moon. And it's an issue I run into in New York all the time, which is that when you shoot with a 24 mil, let's say, master Steadicam shot, the tallest, like an 80-foot Condor or 125-foot Condor at the end of a city block is in the frame when you're at the other end of the block with the Steadicam. So you can't backlight a street in New York from a Condor unless it's only halfway down the block. But then if the Condor is halfway down the block, then the Condor is in the frame. Or, the tallest Condor you can get is 180 foot. You can bring it in from Staten Island or somewhere. But even that, you can start to get it out of frame at that distance. But I'm constantly running into, I can't backlight a street unless the light is in mid-block and not at the end of the block. Or, I can light the end of the block from around the corner and I could light the back end of the street, but it won't reach the actors. It'll light the back end of the background. But to backlight the actors, I either need to be on a rooftop or have a scissor lift or Condor in mid-block, and then have visual effects either painted out or, something. And it's constantly comes up over and over again. I'll ask for rooftop access, and they can't get access, then I have to get a lift, and I have to talk to visual effects about, can I paint out this lift? There's a fight scene in it down by Tompkins Square Park at the end of season 1, I think. We had a movie following Joel as he gets beat up in the street, and I backlit it from mid-block with a scissor lift, 80 foot, I don't know what it was, with a blue gel 10K or 20K. But during the fight, we dropped down when he hits the ground, and we end up looking straight up at my light, and visual effects turned it into a moon. It was beautiful. It's a beautiful shot. They're falling around, and suddenly he gets hit, and the camera goes low, and there's a moon in the sky for a few frames, and then it comes up again, and we lose it again. But that was just the way of the fact there's a big light in the frame there. So
now I'm trying to think if anybody ever uses like window washing rigs, or like there's so many cranes downtown that like on the tops of buildings. Like,
well, I'm discovering the problem in New York is location fees are so high that they'll say like, well, we can get this rooftop, and it's going to cost $20,000 just to put a light on that rooftop. And then you go like, well, the Condor starts to be cheaper than the rooftop, which seems strange, But
you're like bringing in this massive machine, parking it, rigging it up,
getting permits, and it's still cheaper.
Having a person up there is cheaper than just getting
putting a light on a roof.
Yeah.
Because the owner wants $15,000 to put it on his roof.
As soon as they hear the words Amazon or Apple, TV, they're like, more.
Are there any like this is shitty rigs after all, so are there any like little weird tricks that you've found throughout the years of, maybe aren't conventional per se, or something that you used to do on indie movies that kind of was a hack to...
Did you ever build your own light?
Yeah.
I did so many of those sort of things in the beginning, but I don't remember. I still have in my garage my first light, which was when I started out in Super 8. It was all shooting Kodachrome and Plus X, all slow 40 ASA film. So I found in a garage sale a $5 movie light, which was a 650 watt tungsten open face light made in the 60s for Super 8 filmmaking. So it was a little plastic housing, got really hot. It was meant to be screw on the top of a Super 8 camera, but it was extremely bright. So this was my big light for a long time. I learned the light by using this one bright light that I could use their strong backlights, or I could do a big bounce with it. And then I used photo floods and reflector dish bulbs. And I couldn't find lighting gels when I started out, so I went to the art stores and I would buy colored tissue paper. So I'd clip colored tissue paper to reflector dish lamps, and I'd get pink or blue or pale colors that way. And it looked actually a very pretty effect, because that was sort of my low-tech thing.
It's part of
I've
part of
certainly
it, like creative.
I've certainly done things like grabbed a cooler lid off an ice chest and put on a C-stand on a car rig for a fill light or something like that. You know,
yeah. Whatever you have at the moment.
It's white. It can be used. Pizza boxes. People have done all those sort of things. If T-shirts, whatever is lying around, jackets.
I have to say, David, the thing I'm most impressed about is considering how stressful your job is, you seem very calm about everything and just like very collected, going through all these things.
Well, I internalize all my stress. So.
That's got to be good for you.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah, I'm only 25.
Are you a professor at CalArts now? Is that you said something about your students? Do you teach?
No, I talk a lot online to students from film schools. They send me emails and send me messages all the time. And I visit film schools, and I also occasionally teach at the ASC master classes. So, I'm always in contact with students, but I don't teach at a specific school.
Yeah.
I just visit schools.
Yeah. You also seem to be willing to just share this wealth of knowledge that you have, as opposed to gatekeeping this information. Is that part of just your philosophy with working?
Well, because I couldn't get into film school for a long time. I like I said, I spent 10 years on my own shooting films before I went to CalArts. I taught myself filmmaking by reading. So I would go to the UCLA libraries or the Academy Library, any library that had film books in LA. I would go to the AFI Library, the USC Library, the UCLA Library, the Academy Motion Picture Arts Library. I'd pull down books and magazines and just read and read and read for years. And I've read every issue of American Cinematographer going back to 1918. I've read every issue of International Photographer going back to 1950. I've read every issue of SMPTE Journal going back to 1940. I've read issues of magazines that have disappeared over the years, Super 8 Filmmaker.
Wow.
And Lighting Dimensions was a magazine for a while in the 80s and 90s that disappeared. Film and Video Journal, all these magazines, pre-internet days. But because I learned by reading, which meant I learned by the generosity of other people sharing their knowledge in print to a journalist or writing a book, I didn't feel like it was my knowledge to hoard. It was other people's knowledge that I was just passing on through me. So I've never felt like a gatekeeper because it wasn't my knowledge to begin with. I only learned because someone else was generous with their knowledge.
It's a great way to think about it.
Yeah, for sure. That's awesome.
That, and I suffer from male answer syndrome, kind of the need to raise their hand in class and always answer the question. I've always tended to just repeat, what I know back out again. I don't know. It's just sort of a habit of mine, I think.
I mean, that's the best way to learn, right? Is through repetition, I guess.
Yeah.
It's like...
That's why I reread a lot of books that I've read before, too. It's, and rewatch movies. My favorite movies I rewatched multiple times. It's repetition reinforces memory. So, I remember things because I've read it 3 or 4 times.
Yeah.
What are your favorite movies? Now we got to ask.
Well, what inspired me when I was young is, and I grew up in the 70s, I was a big science fiction nerd. So I watched a lot of Star Trek. So in the 70s, it was all television, science fiction television, Star Trek and Space 1999 and anything else that was on TV. And then when I was 15, Star Wars came out, Close Encounters came out, and I saw 2001 for the first time. So in 1 year, I saw 3 movies that radically changed my life to go into filmmaking.
Yeah.
Then Superman, the movie, came out the next year, and that I found that issue of American Cinematographer is the first time I picked up that magazine. And Jeffrey Unsworth, who shot Superman, had passed away. And the film starts with the first title card in Superman is dedicated to the memory of Jeffrey Unsworth, because he passed away shooting tests for Polanski right after that. So I was like, who did they dedicate this movie to? And then I found American Cinematographer, and Peter McDonald, his camera operator, wrote an article about the making of the film, but it also became an article about the life of Jeffrey Unsworth and the years he'd spent with him doing Cabaret and Murder on the Orient Express and all these other films. And so I started learning what a cinematographer did by reading that and reading more and more about Jeffrey Unsworth. And so Superman, and then when going back to watch Cabaret, those films really influenced me. And then after that, Alien and Empire Strikes Back came out in '79, Apocalypse Now, so that era had a profound influence on me. And then in college, seeing The Godfather and other films. And I kept going backwards in time. Everyone inspired me. I would read about what inspired them. So Spielberg said that he really liked John Frankenheimer films and Michael Curtiz films, and then I'd have to watch Michael Curtiz and John Frankenheimer films. And then when he says, well, what I really learned was watching so-and-so, I'd go, Orson Welles said that he learned filmmaking by watching John Ford. So after watching Orson Welles films, I'd watch John Ford's films. So I just kept going backwards in time, finding out who inspired the previous generation. So, but those 70s films were my start, really.
Yeah.
And a lot of the American and the British cinematographers, Jeffrey Unsworth, David Watkin, Freddie Francis, and Freddie Young, the American cinematographers, and Gordon Willis and Conrad Hall, and then Storaro. And once I got into college and saw Apocalypse Now and started really studying filmmaking, that's when Storaro was winning his Oscars for Reds and Apocalypse Now and Last Emperor, and so he became a major influence. And Alan Davia with E.T. and Empire of the Sun, and I actually met Alan Davia a couple times once I moved to L.A. And the other big influence was Close Encounters. When I was 15, I saw Close Encounters, and I got to meet Vilmos Zsigmond when I got to L.A. It was great. I moved to L.A. in middle college. I went to see Passage to India, which is David Lean's last film. And sitting next to me was Vilmos Zsigmond, who had just been nominated for The River. Wow. And I was turned over and I said, oh, you're Vilmos Zsigmond. Right before the film ran, I started talking about Close Encounters and everything I learned from it and blah, blah, blah. And he just kept listening. And his wife sat down next to him with the popcorn. And he goes, this guy really likes my movies. So, I was a real nerd. I still am, but I used to sneak into the AFI, would run screenings with cinematographers. I wasn't an AFI student, but at the time the screenings were public. So I'd sit there and see, Caleb Deschanel show The Natural and talk about it. Vilmos Zsigmond showed Sugar Line Express and talk about it. I would take lots of notes. Alan Davia showed Avalon. So I learned a lot from those lectures at AFI, even though I wasn't a student. But I was such a nerd because I'd read everything about these films that I would find myself correcting these, like Vilmos Zsigmond said, well, I shot this movie on 5247. I go, oh, sir, no, 5247 came out in the summer of 1976. You shot this movie in 74 when 5254 was out. And, oh, yeah, I think you're right. Yeah.
You were that guy.
That's wild.
Yeah.
Like, that guy can't come to these screenings anymore.
That's just, I remember talking to Ozzie Morris about all his films, and he was another idol of mine. And he said, oh, I shot all my 60s films on 100 ASA film. And I go, what? But 100 ASA film didn't come out until 1968, 69 with 5254. You would have shot on 5250, 5251, which are 50 ASA films. He said, really? I swear I shot on 100 ASA films. He was, he's probably pushing everything to stop and rating it at 100.
Yeah, exactly. And at that point, how many films has he done? So it's
He just didn't shoot in the first 8 years of this.
Yeah.
That's incredible. Well, I'm super grateful for you having for being a historian, such a film historian, and just even like having this wealth of knowledge, and again for coming on our podcast and chatting with us. So
Yeah, sorry if a bunch of people email you after this.
what have you done? But yeah, David, thank you again for being on the podcast, and thank you guys for watching. We'll put David's information in the description so you can find out where to see his work and follow him on Instagram and all that good stuff. And yeah, we'll catch you on the next one. Thanks, everybody.
See ya.